I'm calling to order this public hearing. This is a public hearing of the Committee of the Whole. I'm Phil Mendelson, Chairman of the Council of the District of Columbia and Committee of the Whole. Today is Friday, March 19th, 2021. The time is 4:09 in the afternoon, and this hearing is being conducted virtually. It's being broadcast live on the Chairman's website, www.chairmanmendelson.com/live. It will be available on the Council's website, which is www.dccouncil.us, and available on cable TV within a few days after it is uploaded. My guess is that it means Monday. Again, it's being streamed live at www.chairmanmendelson.com/live. The subject of this hearing is District of Columbia Auditor's report entitled Measuring What Matters, More and Better Data Needed to Improve DC Public Schools. This report was issued on March 10th, that is about a week ago, by the auditor, and it was in response to a requirement in DC Law 22-268. DC Law 22-268 is entitled the District of Columbia Education Research Practice Partnership Establishment and Audit Act of 2018. That law established a District of Columbia Education Research Practice Partnership, which is still in the going through the stages of being set up. A vendor was selected. I'm not sure vendor is the right word. An entity was selected to be the research practice partnership. And the research practice partnership is going to undertake various studies of public education in the district on a continuing and long-term basis. And in order for it to do that research and those studies, it's going to be necessary for the research practice partnership to have access to data. And so part of the law establishing the research practice partnership, or RPP, required the auditor to undertake an audit of the data management and data collection practices of public local education agencies, as well as the Office of the State Superintendent of Education and the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Education and the Public Charter School Board. So all this is in preparation of the district's launch of the education RPP, and the audit that was issued, or the report that was issued last week, fulfills that requirement. The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony from the auditor and the executive and the Public Charter School Board about the results and findings of the audit. This hearing is limited to witnesses only. However, the record will be open for 2 weeks. That is, it will close at 5 p.m. on April 1st. And so if anybody wishes to submit comments regarding the audit or the state of data, they're welcome to do so to the Committee of the Whole, again by 5 p.m. on April 1st. There are a couple other members who are present. I'll recognize them for opening statements if they have any, for up to 3 minutes. Councilmember White, I believe you were first to arrive.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Auditor, and to your staff for your work on this important audit. I want to start by focusing on our students, because I believe that in the midst of too many of our conversations about education policy, budgets, and school data, sometimes we lose our way and forget that we're talking about children. And we have to consistently recalibrate to make sure we are not in defensive postures, and that at every step we are making the best decisions for our children. Now let me turn to data, what data we do have, what data are missing, and what data are incomplete or in progress, and how this affects our students and teachers. The findings of the audit are clear. We need more data, enough data to track the progress of each student over time. For all the data that are missing or incomplete, we do have assessment data. The assessment data highlight one fact, that our public school system is shortchanging our most vulnerable students. Although some progress has been made over the years, there is no sense of urgency to figure out how to close the gaps in achievement between white students and students of color, students with disabilities, students at risk of academic failure, and English language learners. Let me say this more plainly. The acceptable measure of progress for Black students is too slow and too low. About 75% of Black students are not on grade level. My friend Kimberlyn Butler recently said something that stuck with me. She said, data have a heartbeat. What that means is, what do we think is going to happen to that 75%, the overwhelming majority of Black students in our schools? How can we not ring the alarm and say we need to identify what is not working? Outcomes like these continue because we are desensitized enough to accept that this is okay. We are desensitized, desensitized that when a DCPS parent of 2 little Black girls rings the alarm because 75% of Black children are not on grade level, a proposal to examine what is wrong is called dangerous. There is a tragic disconnect between the people who are privileged to have a seat at the table and those who are not. My kids will be okay. Everyone in this hearing, your kids will be okay, but that is not the right measure. One could argue that Black students falling behind at astronomical rates is not a governance or data issue, that it has to do with poverty or home life or a number of other factors. And I would say the data could show us the commonalities so that we could target the appropriate resources based on the specific needs of specific subgroups. But we don't have the data we need. We can't say whether the achievement data is consistent for all Black students across income ranges or for all students with disabilities across racial or ethnic groups, to diagnose issues and create early warning systems that would allow us to direct more specific resources to students who need them. According to the auditor's report, there are significant limitations on student course data, student enrollment data, exit data, teacher data, and in-school and out-of-school suspension data. I believe that this lack of data is linked to our current governance structure. No one believes that an independent state superintendent will magically improve education, but rather that he or she would challenge our education leadership in the way it needs to be challenged, not by looking for data to reinforce the beliefs we started with, but by challenging these beliefs so we can get better. This is probably why no other superintendent in the country reports to a chief executive. Some found my approach to simply have broad conversations about our governance structure to determine what is and isn't working, and to work together to fix the equity issues in our public education system too radical. I remain baffled about this conclusion. OSSE's independence would have been one piece of that broader conversation, but we are here today with this very concerning report from the auditor talking about missing or incomplete data. But what if there was a state superintendent who would take this critical look at our
Councilmember White
on an ongoing basis instead of our auditor?
Councilmember White.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
It was 3 minutes for opening statements. You're a minute over.
May I have 30 more seconds?
Sure.
Thank you. I want to thank the chairman for his commitment to hold the hearing on the OSSE independence bills this year, because we do have to have these conversations about how to empower OSSE to collect all of the data we need to inform our decisions and to do better. I look forward to hearing from our education leaders today. I hope we will not lose sight of the fact that the data we discuss here today are not cold, detached numbers, but children. We can't say we have all the data we need, or that we can't do better, or that there aren't gaps in our public education that can be fixed. The questions need to be, what more do we need? What more do we need to do? And how do we work together to get it done? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Che.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this incredibly important hearing today. We know from the past, particularly from some scandals that occurred, there was one in particular in 2017 involving a high school that got national acclaim because it turns out that this school, which had had very, very low graduation rates and really a sad sort of success on tests and that sort of thing, suddenly had every one of its graduates going to college. And what we learned from that was that the data that were being reported about graduations were a fiction, and they were being they were the result of this extreme pressure that was put on teachers and staff, school leadership, punitive top-down, instructions to make sure that students were passed through. And it's not just the one school. There were a number of schools with large disparities between the percentage of students who graduate and the percentage of students who are actually prepared to enter college or the workforce. And it looked like we were just awarding the diplomas just to move students out. That's just one aspect of what we discovered. And then we discovered even more that there were other serious gaps in data, serious lack of understanding about what was really going on in the schools. And we have had for years now, despite some successes, we still have a situation which is actually bordering on criminal, where we'll start out with students, beginning school, and then hopefully 12 years later, we realize that we've set them up for failure. We've actually disabled them from being able to enter the workforce or post high school education. Now, the data that we collect, from the data we collect to the oversight to the reporting of it, it's not done in an honest and transparent way, and it's not done comprehensively. And as I've said many times, we can't reform a system if we don't measure what's going on, and we have to measure it honestly, accurately, and comprehensively. So this new research practice partnership, the bill that I put in and we passed included this audit, because we need better data. We just need better data. It's clear. And we're never going to narrow the gap between the students who are struggling and those who are making it through, unless we know what's wrong. Another bill that I have in the hopper is totally dependent upon this. We need to focus on each individual student and make a plan if that student is struggling to bring that student up to where he or she needs to be. So we need to get this right. This is a foundational issue. And so I'd like to thank the auditor for her work on this. And I hope we can move forward and fix what needs to be fixed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Che. Councilmember Lewis George.
Thank you, Chairman Mendelson, for holding today's roundtable, and thank you to our witnesses for making time to speak with us today. This new report by the Auditor's Office raises a lot of really important questions and has me very concerned about our ability to adequately respond to educational crisis we're in. We've had thousands of children learning remotely for over a year now, and we need the Office of State Superintendent of Education to support schools as they distribute federal relief aid grants and to try to catch our kids back up. OSSE needs to do its job so our teachers can teach and our students can learn. By all accounts, OSSE has improved its data collection and governance practices, particularly in recent years. In 2015, the National Academy of Sciences released its report entitled Evaluation of Public Schools of the District of Columbia, Reform in a Changing Landscape, a 5-year effort that included a review of the district's data collection. At the time of that report's publication, OSSE was described as a large and complicated bureaucracy that struggled to gain its footing and earn the trust of DC government officials. OSSE is still a young agency, particularly compared to its peers in other states, and has absolutely gotten better. But that does not absolve them of their current responsibilities today. This audit found that OSSE is still not collecting all the data they can, particularly around teachers, student courses, and workforce outcomes for all high school students. We have a lot left to do. So I plan to ask about the following today's roundtable. Where has OSSE made the most strides in improving data collection? Why is it important to collect and maintain longitudinal education data? How does OSSE's current data warehouse compare to those in other states? And what data elements are we still not collecting that we should be? And what are we doing to cut off the school to prison pipeline? And undergirding a lot of today's discussion will be the issue of governance. We have 2 bills before us to take 2 paths to the same destination, OSSE independence. Whether the state superintendent serving at the pleasure of the mayor adds undue political influence is an issue for another day. What I hope today's discussion gets at is what the root causes of our current struggles with collecting, maintaining, and using longitudinal data. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all to all our witnesses, particularly the auditor, for this comprehensive study, and I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Lewis George. We'll proceed now to the witnesses. We're going to do the auditor first. If Kathy Patterson could be let in. One of the things I like about Zoom is these delays, and we wait and we see the box, and then the auditor appears. Ms. Patterson, do you want to proceed? We have a copy of your statement.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Committee of the Whole. I'm Kathy Patterson, DC Auditor. I'm joined by Aaron Roth, who's the Director of Education Research for the Office of the DC Auditor, and our consultants on this project, Dr. Brandon Caveney and Dorothy Jean Craddy of Data Ethics, are available for questions. We're pleased to share the results of the recently published education data audit mandated by the Council 2 years ago, as the Chairman noted. We based the work not only on the specific requirements of the Act, but the more expansive provisions of the legislation as introduced, and testimony before the Council on the kind of information parents, teachers, principals, and other stakeholders wish to see to better guide their efforts to improve education achievement and current law. The report, Measuring What Matters, found that the district state education agency, the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, has failed to build necessary data systems and collect the data needed to adequately support students in schools. More specifically, schools, teachers, families are left without important information needed to best serve the students' needs, growth, mobility, and supports over time. Information like accurate attendance, absenteeism data, growth on standardized tests over time, and tracking of individual students through the years. And importantly, the burden of this failure is disproportionately borne by our most vulnerable students in schools. Our top line findings: the District of Columbia does not have a statewide longitudinal data system, despite $10 million in federal funding and $25 million in district funding to that end. Without such a system, we have limited ability to effectively assess and address learning loss post-COVID. Similarly, we have limited ability to accurately assess and address racial equity issues across our public schools. We also documented issues with the validity of data in OSSE publications, including our school report cards. We also documented the risk of compliance challenges with federal data submissions. We find that the SEA, our state education agency, has not fulfilled its mandate as a state agency by choosing not to collect critical data from all schools to fulfill the requirements of an SLDS. Our state education agency does not serve students directly. Rather, the focus of the responsibility is to monitor the educational progress of all students in schools using a proxy, and that proxy is data. To the extent that needed data are non-existent, partial, flawed, not reported, or not used, our SEA is not meeting its fundamental responsibility to know and understand students in schools. This puts at risk basic monitoring of educational services and compliance reporting like student discipline and safety, district-wide educational improvements, and the potential for future federal grants. We do realize that the average reader or listener, or even public officials, may be challenged to fully understand concepts like longitudinal data. That means information that combines multiple pieces of information on individual students over time to see patterns and trends. We separate here the issues into these buckets: data we do not collect, data we collect only in part, data we collect but do not share, how we could better use the data we do collect, what our education consumers could be receiving, and what an aspirational data system might look like. And we end with a section on fact checking. Right now in the district, we don't collect 3 categories of critical information: student courses, credits, and grades, teacher-student linkages, information on student supports. And we're going to show one of the charts from the report that has a lot of data packed into it. The first of these 3 are fundamental for understanding and tracking educational progress in the district. We cannot assess student progress, equity, and access, or develop evidence-based improvement strategies without student course data. Student courses, credits, and grades are needed to develop robust early warning systems that would help us identify students at risk of academic failure and disengagement, the very students the Councilmember Louis George just referred to. The courses a student takes and the grades they receive have been shown to be better predictors of high school graduation and post-secondary success than standardized test scores, but we do not collect them. Student-teacher links show who is teaching whom. By not tracking these links, we can't assess how teachers are distributed among students and across schools, wards, or courses. The council mandated that OSSE create a plan to implement a school climate survey in every school serving 6th to 12th grade students by this school year. Instead, OSSE recommended that each local education agency choose its own climate survey, again leaving the district without comparable information on student engagement and supports across all students and all schools. And as districts turn to post-COVID, what metrics are states relying on heavily now during the pandemic? Precisely these same ones: student courses, credits, or grades for all 6th through 12th graders, and student supports or other whole child data like school climate survey data for students, parents, or teachers, or other school-based interventions. The absence of this data was underscored in testimony before this committee last week. Councilmember Louis George asked Acting State Superintendent Shauna Young how many of the district's 9th graders are on track to graduate, and Ms. Young said she could not provide the answer. She cited the lack of standardized test scores as a main reason, but had the district been collecting course, credit, grades, climate surveys, or other student support data, the critical information on 9th grader progress would have been available. I'm now going to turn to my colleague, Erin, to go over some of the data issues. Can you?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you, Chairman Mendelson and Council Members Che, Councilmember White, and Councilmember Louis George. I'm going to focus on the next 4 categories of data that Kathy mentioned: what we collect only in part, what we collect but do not share, what we could do with what we have, and what DC education consumers don't have. And the reason I'll focus on these 4 categories is to highlight, as Kathy did, the difference between just collecting data and actual longitudinal data use. Most of what OSSE does collect is collected only in part, which means that the district is severely limited when it comes to meaningful data use, like driving a car with faulty parts in key places like the steering column, wheels, and brakes, and not being able to reliably stop or turn. To actually use district-wide education data brings problems and risks due to data collected only in part. Some of these data are not collected district-wide, meaning we are missing certain students, schools, or teachers, while others are missing large swaths of data for most students, and other key data elements are unusable due to inconsistent definitions over time or within the same year, but differences by sector. These elements include student enrollment, entries and exits, student enrollment by program type, attendance, discipline, many aspects of teacher data, robust early childhood, CTE, and adult education data, post-secondary, workforce, and other agency data linked to education. In addition, there are data that we do collect, but don't yet share locally, including data collected on contracts or grants paid with district tax dollars. For example, as noted, the teacher data we collect is incomplete, but nonetheless, we do report these data to the federal government while not reporting it all locally. We report multiple data points across many years to the Office of Civil Rights for the Civil Rights Data Collection, or CRDC, and also fail to report all of this information locally. The Every Student Succeeds Act specifically asks that states share locally CRDC data reported to the federal government. Finally, although we pay for a contract with the National Student Clearinghouse, which reliably tracks the post-secondary enrollment, persistence, and graduation rates for more than 90% of all post-secondary students across the country, we routinely fail to report these data locally. After ODCA began this audit, OSSE did start last year to report on post-secondary enrollment, but it's still not reporting on persistence and graduation. Next, there's more that we could do with the data we have, but we aren't currently doing. Although our data is limited and problematic, the data collected does represent students, real students that deserve and require focus and monitoring at the statewide district level. We can immediately begin increased data use and reporting, ideally driven by repeated stakeholder demand for analysis in key areas like teacher turnover, demographics, student learning, and mobility. It is this actual use of data that is best known and the most effective strategy for increasing quality and sustainability. As data are used and made accessible, more education stakeholders have opportunities to engage and communicate needed adjustments to increase reliability. And as data are used, more district residents, practitioners, and policymakers become invested in building more data capacity. For example, even though we don't have course, credit, and grade information, we could right now build a limited initial early warning system that would return attendance, behavior, and achievement data to educators. We could create high school feedback reports, and in fact, committed to this in our second SLDS grant. These are the most in-demand state-level reporting by LEAs across the country. These reports show levels of incoming achievement, attendance, and behavior for each high school, as well as include key metrics on access and outcomes within each high school. We could do this tomorrow while we are also investing in a long-term pathway to better data and systems. Lastly, I'll turn to what DC education consumers don't yet have. Right now, we don't have access to the same level of reporting and analysis that is available to our counterparts in other states. And we are not speaking of very elite high-income school districts. This data use is supported with federal grant money and collaborative state work across the country. Accessing data and using interactive tools in Washington, Kentucky, Arkansas, Montana, Texas, Rhode Island, Wisconsin, Illinois, Hawaii, Alaska, Tennessee, and Maryland, to name just a few, yields analysis that we don't have available here. These include longitudinal data on teachers, schools, and students that is interwoven to show educational opportunities and contexts. Many of these states also link to statewide early childhood, post-secondary, and workforce outcomes, in addition to longitudinal use of K-12 data. The next figure that I will show you is one chart from Arkansas's large teacher data collection. And I had many graphics to choose from. This one shows the breakdown of teacher experience by race, ethnicity. And again, this is just one of the many slices of data available on Arkansas's teachers. The next figure is an example of just one of Washington's data dashboards that shows college enrollment, persistence beyond the first year, the highest degrees of that students attained post-high school graduation, and all graduates' median earnings right now up to 12 years after graduation. The next figure is from Montana, and this shows the kind of information that every single teacher in Montana has access to as they plan to address learning loss for a new classroom of students, including coursework, grades, attendance, and behavior over time for each student in their class. Our district teachers do not have this information available to them yet. And if you'll note, you can see all of the different data elements for each individual student on the left, and how often this early warning system repeats itself to give you each teacher probabilities so that they can intervene and target resources quickly and as needed. The next picture is a school level early warning system, and this goes to LEAs and school leaders so that they can also track how their school compares to the rest of the state and how their students are doing over time and intervene and advocate for supports as needed. I'll turn back to Kathy to talk about moving forward.
Thank you, Erin. The audit doesn't just show what we don't collect. It also shows that we can immediately start using existing data better, as Erin noted. District students are graduating and entering a competitive post-secondary and workforce world, and members of the council don't have data that demonstrates how district students are doing. Do they have equitable access to post-secondary enrollment, persistence, and degree attainment, for example? Are they prepared for the workforce? What are their earnings? We do know that there are red flags that haven't been heeded. In 2017, the University of the District of Columbia shared with the State Board of Education that 126 out of 128 newly enrolled students from DCPS high schools needed remedial coursework. Your performance oversight records show that students have complained to the Ombudsman that they cannot access the transcripts they need for work or college. We recommend using the data we do collect to give you answers that are available now. And we've been talking about the need to complete the build out of a statewide longitudinal data system referring to the pre-K to 12 education data and recommend that this be a clear priority. But that isn't the end point. The best practices review undertaken as part of the audit brought up a wealth of information on what innovative state governments are doing beyond linking what happens in the elementary grades with middle school success or preparation for high school. Forward-looking states have moved ahead with P20W plus data systems that bring specific data securely from across systems, linking early childhood, K-12, post-secondary, workforce, and other sectors to identify how well our education system has functioned and where the gaps might be. Such systems in Kentucky and Ohio, for example, provide the in-state and out-of-state employment outcomes for post-secondary graduates from both states and enable you to see the employment outcomes associated with specific institutions, including majors declared and credentials earned. 2 years ago, the California legislature passed the Cradle to Career Data Systems Act to create a statewide data infrastructure to help state agencies improve education and workforce policies and programs and support statewide research efforts. They're attempting to launch multiple statewide tools, including something as detailed as an electronic transcript exchange app to help high schools, colleges, and universities efficiently share information and permit families to access the resources they need from anywhere in the state. This is just a quick glance at strides other states are making to better use data and linkages to help drive policy and individual decision-making. And we obviously can't run until we're walking securely. We will not have a statewide longitudinal data system until public officials reach some kind of consensus on what exists in the district today, what we do have, and what we do not have. And that brings me to the last section of our testimony. And I share here some corrections to the public record on issues including statements that have been made in conjunction with this audit, and I share these with you for the record. The final one of these statements I will read into the record. Quote, "We have access to longitudinal student level data from across the education continuum, from birth to adulthood, and can draw linkages across this continuum to analyze the relationship between inputs and outcomes. This carefully worded statement seemingly implies that we have a longitudinal system, and our question would be, if we have access, where's that access displayed and for what purpose? ODCA and our contract partners audited every document published by the Office of the State Superintendent of Education. We found no examples of longitudinal data use, not one." I mentioned earlier the statement that the acting state superintendent made when asked about ninth graders being on track to graduate. As Aaron said, the district could act now to use the data it does collect on attendance and behavior and prior test scores and growth to make a rudimentary ninth grade early warning system. But there's no evidence of this type of longitudinal data use in OSSE reporting or planning. And I do recommend that you ask the executive to provide evidence of this statement if they do continue to make it. Finally, in conclusion, the Office of the DC Auditor has presented this education data audit as a good faith effort to meet the statutory requirement and to provide documented and credible evidence on what education data the district collects and uses. And Mr. Chairman, I continue to hope that the mayor and her education team will finally permit the ODCA team of experts who undertook this work to meet and discuss the findings and recommendation with the data team at the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, a request I've made continually since November. I believe progress is possible based on consensus and communication. This concludes our testimony, and we're happy to respond to questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, council members.
Thank you, Ms. Patterson. So there'll be one round of 10-minute round of questions, maybe a little bit more. I want to start with this question, for which I think I know the answer, but I want to put it on the record. It has been said, and it's said in the report, that the quote, "the district's education data lack integrity." And generally when I think of the word integrity, I think of honesty. What do you mean when you say that the education data lacks integrity? Do you mean that it's dishonest?
I think we mean primarily, and I'll let Aaron weigh in here, we mean primarily the statistical integrity, that the numbers aren't necessarily honest because we don't have all the necessary caveats to say, for example, this report that we're sharing as if it represents all of our schools and students really only represents maybe 50 of the 68 LEAs in the District of Columbia. That's primarily what we meant. And in point of fact, the difference between the implication of integrity meaning honesty is why we changed the title of our report from the draft title. We didn't want to use that expression in the draft title that we used in the draft title. And this was something that that arose in some of the briefings we were doing in our meetings with some of the attorneys that we met with in November. But Aaron, do you want to say a little bit more about the statistical integrity issues?
Sure. Yes, that's what we're referring to as statistical integrity. And what that means is the data lack reliability and validity, those two things.
So it's not, I don't want to overwork this, but it's not dishonesty, but for instance, inconsistent definitions between LEAs, let's say, or incomplete data from, I think Ms. Patterson said 60 LEAs when there are more LEAs than that. Missing a grade, that kind of stuff, so that it's hard to, the reliability is.
Right. The reliability means if we go back and collect the same thing 100 more times, are we going to get the same answer 100 more times? Validity means, are we collecting exactly what we think and say we are collecting, or is it actually reflecting something else?
Now, in your statement, Ms. Patterson, you didn't say anything about compliance, but I have a question about compliance because I think that's certainly come up in discussions I've had about the report. To my knowledge, the U.S. Department of Education or federal agencies have not found that OSSE or the district are out of compliance. So I think the report questions though compliance. Am I wrong in my understanding?
No, there are two very closely related issues here. One is when we are at risk of being out of compliance. As auditors, we have to note when there is a risk. We don't want to be out of compliance. But there are, in fact, a few instances when we do document that we, in fact, are out of compliance. And let me ask Aaron to give some detail on that, particularly, I think, the in-school suspension issue.
That's right. And this is a collection that OSSE has changed, I believe, starting as of this year. So it'd be great to get more clarity there. But a very encouraging shift to collect that data using their automated data transfer system instead of on spreadsheets. Prior to that, the discipline data was collected for charter LEAs via a PCSB discipline data collection that didn't include in-school suspension. Transparently didn't include in-school suspension. So when those data were then collected by OSSE, we didn't have a complete discipline data collection. OSSE then reached back out to LEAs to certify the extent to which those in-school suspension values were zero. And some LEAs did certify those zeros and some chose not to certify. So we didn't have a complete in-school suspension discipline data collection at that time.
Ms. Patterson, the OSSE contends that it does have a longitudinal data system. I really want to say SLED, even though nobody else has said that. You contend that they don't. So you've explained why you think they don't. Why is there this disagreement? How can OSSE say that it does?
Mr. Chairman, then I would respectfully recommend that you ask them to share with you examples of longitudinal use of data. For example, the charts that Aaron described from Montana, from Arkansas, that we have some additional ones in the report. Ask OSSE to provide you with the same data that are shown in those charts. Those are longitudinal data usages, particularly when you look at the that one chart from Montana that an individual teacher would have on each student. That shows how that individual student, called Jane Doe on the chart, but how Jane did from year to year to year. If OSSE has that data, they do not make it available. And that's what I would just respectfully request, that you ask them to provide you with evidence of longitudinal use of data. As I said, we audited every document they produced. We did not find it.
Well, I will ask them a similar question. Now, you had some recommendations for the council. That the council enact legislation to build an SLDS that meets federal requirements and best practices for data elements and system capacities as outlined in this report. Require data governance policies and stakeholder engagement practices to help ensure the system is successful and sustainable, and provide for regular monitoring and reports on each step to ensure success. Do we really need legislation to do that? And what would the legislation say? Be it enacted that OSSE shall comply with federal requirements?
It could say a number of things. It could require all the 18 data elements to be collected. It could require the public engagement structure. It could require all the data governance features that we've described in the report. But no, Mr. Chairman, legislation is not required. The executive could do this consistent with what we told the U.S. Department of Education we would do if we got SLDS grants, and we got 2 of them totaling $10 million. But you also recall, Mr. Chairman, and I want to mention electronic recording of interrogations to you, because that was something that you proposed when we served together, and we tried to get the police department to do it without legislation. They didn't, we legislated. So the reason for suggesting legislation is frankly a last resort that could be considered. But if this hearing today and your questions or the sense of the council are sufficient to persuade the executive to do what they promised to do in seeking the federal grants, then I don't believe legislation would be necessary.
So collecting more data and collecting it in a way that has that statistical integrity, and being, I'm going to say, affirmative in requiring the data, for instance, from the charter sector. That's what the goal of these recommendations are.
Absolutely.
That always, how do I want to put it? It has the legislative challenge. Do we try to write into law something that encompasses everything, or do we want to be more general to allow the executive the flexibility to encompass not only what we would list, but more that we're not thinking of?
Is that a question?
I think it was more a statement to see if you agree.
No, I absolutely agree. I think one of the reasons for introducing legislation is, please don't tell anybody I said this, but one of the reasons for introducing legislation is to nudge the executive to do what you think should be done. And sometimes that has happened. Sometimes that is successful.
All right, I won't tell anybody that you said that. Let me see, I may have one more question very quickly. So the purpose of this audit, the genesis of this audit was the RPP legislation. Are we in such a miserable place with data that the RPP doesn't have a chance? Or is it simply that we now see where there are problems with the data and OSSE needs to move quickly to improve the data?
Obviously, we can go forward with an RPP. There is research that can be done. But one of the really positive features about the RPP is setting up the advisory group that is to set forth the research plan. And once the advisory group develops a research plan, my assumption would be that that would be helpful in knowing which data elements are most important to collect first. So if we look at a chart of 18, we're collecting, all of maybe 5 of those. Which ones do we start adding to that to be able to conduct the research that we think is most important? So there's a very direct way in which the one can sort of nurture the other.
Thank you. Councilmember Robert White.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Madam Auditor and Ms. Roth. Let me start with something that's come up already. The OSSE often mentions that there's a state longitudinal education data system, or SLED, as the chairman mentioned. What is the difference between what OSSE refers to as the statewide longitudinal education data system and what you are talking about when you say longitudinal data?
Let me punt that one to Aaron.
Sure. Thank you, Councilmember White. A statewide longitudinal data system collects, a standard set of elements. Those were established by states who received the SLDS federal grant money. Part of that grant was it was a cooperative grant, and states were required to work together and produce a lot of technical assistance and resource documents for each other. So those standard elements were set by fellow states. So it would collect all of those data, collect them with statistical integrity. Part of an SLDS is that it has an internal auditing function. So you would be able to adjust and correct them. And then the other two big pillars of an SLDS that Kathy's been talking about a lot are data use and accessibility. So if you go look at Kentucky's website, for example, it's called KY Stats, I believe, at Kentucky. I can it's very easy to Google, but it has a really good set of very clear, easily accessible dashboards that are interactive. You can request a variety of different longitudinal, statewide, customized reports and analytics. That's what it should look like. You really shouldn't need to audit it because it is so accessible. It is obvious and it is at your fingertips.
The public can access it in Kentucky?
There's different user control access, but that's part of an SLDS. It's pretty hard for the federal government to know exactly what's inside of your computer, right? So that's why they required use and accessibility. The reason they believe that you have an SLDS is because they can see it. They can see how you use it, and they see how you make it accessible. So teachers and LEA leaders and school leaders have different access than the rest of the public, for sure. Okay. But everyone has access. That
makes sense. So many of us want more data, but I think most of us, I hope most of us, don't want more standardized tests. Would collecting the data that you're talking about require any more testing? No.
No, and in fact, it would give you the information to be able to look at growth, and Aaron would probably be better at giving you the differentiation between growth and what we were seeing on PARCC tests. But growth shows individual students over time. The standardized tests say last year's fourth grade did worse than this year's fourth grade. It doesn't tell you how Johnny did. So it's the standard, the SLDS level of data would give you more information on individual students.
On the issue of growth, Ms. Roth, is there anything you need to add to that? Or is that?
No, there is part 5 in the report does go into the difference between growth and proficiency and the importance of making both accessible to educators. In addition, both a growth on our standardized test scores and the subclaim values for each of our PARCC tests are, various sections of our math tests are available and not accessible to teachers yet. Operators, functions, algebraic equations, teachers can get a lot more information. But in SLDS, a robust one should in fact make it easier to lean on all these different legs of the table outside of test scores. You should have so much more. Test scores are just one small piece of that.
Okay. How do states, you had mentioned that one state in particular that collects, and you showed this post-graduate information on students post-high school graduation. How do they collect that?
Aaron?
Sure. There's a lot of cross-sector agency collaboration. Some of that has required legislation in other states. There are, depending on what cross-sector data you're trying to merge, there are federal and local laws that are relevant. So you might need a legislation in some of these cases. Some states are putting together health, criminal justice, workforce, earnings, unemployment, all those sectors together. So it depends on which one, but post-secondary is typically the easiest. We are a little bit unique in DC in our post-secondary system, but what we do have already in place, as does every other state, is a contract with the National Student Clearinghouse. So we already have all the post-secondary data that we could want.
Okay. And you mentioned some data that's collected in part. You mentioned enrollment data. How could that be collected in part? We know what students are in our schools, right?
For the most part, in enrollment, you can think of like a parentheses. There's entry and exit. That's how you know where a student is at any given point in time. And we found that we were missing 80% of the final parentheses are end of year exit codes. Mid-year exit codes, we did have much more completeness, but end of year, those were pretty much not there. So at the end of every year, a school should submit the type of exit that a student has. That could simply be that they're promoted from second grade to third grade, or that they're retained in second grade, or they're going to summer school, or they're expected to leave to go to another school. For high schoolers, this has dropout, graduation, any type of credit recovery. There's criminal justice codes, there's health involved codes. There's a lot of codes. We're missing all of them. So that causes a lot of confusion and duplicate enrollments at the start of the next school year, and makes that question that you asked about, do we know exactly where they are at exactly any point in time, a little fuzzier.
And if a parent, based on the work that you did, if I'm a parent who wants to know how students in a particular at-risk category are doing in each school, could I find that data?
As long as the cells aren't too small, but please go ahead, Erin.
Right, there definitely, that would run up in many states against trying to protect personal privacy of students, because you often end up with small cell sizes, in which that it means that you could possibly identify a student, even if there were 8 students in that category. Okay. So that's highly likely, but yeah, I'd have to check, for example, our assessment data to see if it's available at both of those breakdowns, a sub breakdown and then a sub breakdown. I don't recall that it is, but I'm not sure. I have to double check.
And I know there was particular attention to students and teachers, but did you look for, and if so, were you able to find data on programs that are being funded with at-risk dollars so that we could compare what's happening in each school and the outcomes?
We really did not look at funding as an issue. This was really a look of, I almost said narrow. It's not a narrow look, but it was a look limited to data collections, data use, data analysis, okay, not where the money went.
And you also mentioned in the category of data that's collected but not shared, teacher data. What kind of teacher data were you talking about?
There's a yearly required teacher data collection that goes to EdFax at the federal government, and that includes there's quite a long list actually, so I'm not going to remember every single one, but demographics, experience, and credentials are part of that collection that we must collect and report. The federal government did in 2016 produce a report across all states showing those data. Unfortunately, they don't regularly report on them either, but most states do. If you're collecting and reporting it to the federal government, it's typically then provided to local stakeholders.
Okay, I appreciate it. Another question will put me over time. The chairman was kind to let me go over in my opening, so I'm not going to do so here. Thank you both very much for your work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilmember White, there won't be another round. If you want to ask one more question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How long would it take for OSSE to gather the data they would need to build a complete and comprehensive state longitudinal data system?
Quite a while. It would be years, not months. And it would probably need to be done sort of in phases and stages. But one of the first steps we recommended is a off-the-shelf student information system, state level student information system as one of the major building blocks.
Okay. Thank you very much. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Che.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The earlier discussion about legislation gives me an opportunity to note that just this morning I introduced legislation that is meant to improve things in this area in terms of the quality of the education data collection and governance policies. It would require, among other things, that OSSE administer a warehouse for school data, explicitly instructs how OSSE connects the data across schools and sectors and time, and to ensure that the district follows the best data collection practices and doesn't mask or filter things that are inconvenient or negative. There's more to it than that, but since this came up, I'm going to do my own advertisement here. That legislation, as I said, was introduced today. In terms of, immediate, midterm, and long-term kinds of things that we can do, I am very keen, and as I said, I do have separate legislation about this, on identifying as early as possible students who are struggling and providing on an individual basis, because as Councilmember White says, we're talking about not just data, we're talking about the children themselves, to identify those who are struggling so we could have a plan for them to bring them up. Otherwise, they're behind, they'll stay behind, and they may never catch up. So what I want to know is whether, and I think it's a very good point and people should appreciate it, that park testing and generalized kind of testing like that is not the best way to make those identifications. The better way is to see what courses students are taking and the grades that they're getting in those courses. And there may be some other indicia of students struggling. So what I'd like to know in terms of these timeframes, what immediately can we do to be able to identify those students who would need that special help now? I don't want to have a lost generation while we build data sheds or whatever the heck we're doing. Do we have enough there now to be able to identify those students and to be able to make plans that are individualized for their needs?
Aaron began to explain that in terms of what we could do now to have a rudimentary early warning system. Do you want to say more about that, Aaron?
Sure. And I would say quickly too, the last thing we want to do is to not use the data we have because we're worried it's not enough or it's not good enough. Data only gets better and useful if you actually use it and make it accessible. And every state has gone through this. So we need to not be afraid of using what we have, figuring out its flaws, and then continuing to make it better. And yes, we could right now, if the Montana early warning system picture that we showed, for example, had flags for how many days a student was absent in the last 30 days, in the last 60 days, in the last 90 days. It also flagged if they had switched LEAs in the last 3 years and in the last 2 years, and if they had switched schools in the last 3 years, in the last 2 years. So there are a lot of different variables that you want to see together in context. It could be, as you know, that a student is struggling to make it to school on time, but like you said, they have all of the credits. They're proceeding through high school quite perfectly. So then we want to just reach in on attendance and see, what is it? Do they need help getting a sibling to school? What is the issue? But if we don't have all of these things in tandem, it's going to be really hard to provide the right targeted support.
Okay, so we have some, maybe all of this data disparate, who could bring it together for us? Because if grades and the courses that you're taking are the key indicators, but they stand on top of a whole bunch of other factors, whether it be discipline or attendance or what have you, somebody's got to right now, which is what I'm concerned about right now, bring that together so that we can identify students who are struggling. I mean, maybe we can capture most of them by other means, but if we could put all of this together, can we do that now? Who should do that now? And what kind of effort would that take? You know, would we have to have a separate office? Would we have to have more personnel, with more money? What would it take to put us in a position to do that sort of thing right now?
We can do that right now, and OSSE can do that right now. We have attendance and behavior and prior test score data that could be used right now. And oftentimes what states do is they provide, you know, that level of information in an early warning system for everyone, and then LEAs can build on it. So if LEAs want to add more information to it to refine these, you know, risk indicators, they can do that, but they need a foundation provided by the state, and OSSE can do that.
Okay, and we also have a problem, I don't know how this cuts against all of this, but of lost students. We have students, you know, the charter schools start with a certain number of students, and then suddenly they don't have that many anymore. And some of these students who may be struggling are sent away, or they go to DCPS, or students might go from a DCPS school to one of these, I don't know, academies that are for students who are having difficulties of various kinds, and we lose track of them. Do we have the ability right now to be able to follow somebody and make sure they are encompassed within whatever assessments we're able to make?
Yes, absolutely. This is our basic enrollment data. We just need to use it and develop a monitoring system responsive, I think, to you know, educator, school leader, and LEA, and family and student needs to include all of the things that we are concerned about. But we have that mobility data right now.
So right now, and this depends on schools reporting correctly what is happening to their students, where they're going. But if we had that sort of thing, then we could identify right now the students who are struggling, no matter where they are in the system. Right now, we could do that right now.
Yes.
Okay. The other thing about right now, and mention was made of this a couple of times, is the postgraduate data. Again, I have another bill in that would create, you know, a focus on postgraduate data. And Auditor Patterson, you had mentioned some of those really outrageous numbers about the students enrolled at UDC, 126 of 128 needed remedial assistance. And it's even worse if you actually look at the numbers of those who are registered at UDC and those who actually graduate. I don't know that there's an actual number of those who actually make it through, even with remedial assistance and so on. So what can we do right now? See, again, I want to do the long-term thing and all of that, but what can we do right now? Students are going to be graduating soon from our schools. What can we do right now to make sure we're able to follow them? And the bill I have is also a way for them to reach out and get assistance. You know, you have some people, first generation, they're going to college and they don't have a clue. You know, I'm the first in my family to graduate from high school. So when I went to college, it was like, whoa, what is this all about? You know, and sometimes it's a money thing. Maybe they can't afford it and they don't know where they're going to get the money. There are so many things, mentoring and guidance and assistance to them would actually enable them to bridge the gap, and they could make it, but we need to do we have the data right now to help us find out where our people are going, to find out who might be likely in need of aid, either monetary aid or you know, mentoring aid, and be able to actually actively outreach and help those students succeed when after they graduate from high school. Do we have a capability along those lines right now?
We do. We have a variety of indicators throughout high school, and then we already have a contract with the National Student Clearinghouse so that we could be monitoring regular persistence throughout post-secondary and reporting back to high schools and high school teachers so that we would know, where students are struggling once they get to college. If everyone is having trouble in calculus, what can we do at the high school level to proactively fix that? Yes.
And are we doing that sort of thing now? Is that kind of information being carried back to the high schools to show that they need to, beef up their work in calculus or physics or whatever?
There are some ad hoc partnerships, but we don't have a statewide system to provide that type of feedback.
And we had this very strange response about the National Student Clearinghouse data that we were told, no, we can't share that with you because it's a contract, it's information collected on contract, but it's our information. So all of the information that is collected on contract should be readily available. And as Aaron said in the testimony, they began this past year to report on post-secondary enrollment, but not on persistence and graduation. But that's information that we should be sharing.
Okay, thank you, Auditor. Thank you, Ms. Roth, for your help in this, and Mr. Chairman for having this hearing. And let me just note as I depart that this is not something that's unconventional or novel. Other states do this, many other states do this, and we are behind the curve on this to the detriment of our students. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Che. Councilmember Lewis George.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to start with just some questions, and because in education, as we all know, there are lots of terms, and the way individuals interpret what terms mean can help explain how we move forward, and we need context to that. So, Ms. Roth, I want to start with you. You said that data needs to be longitudinal, portable, and interoperable. Can you explain each of those terms in this context and whether OSSE's data meet these standards?
Sure. So longitudinal, basically the best way to look at that is, are we using it in a longitudinal way? And right now, as Kathy said, we are not doing that. So that would entail seeing analyses that combine multiple data elements for individual students over time, ideally over the entire course of their public education career. And interoperable and portable, I'll talk about together if you don't mind, so I don't lose everyone, but it means that we can share data easily across agencies, and that we are sharing data back to schools, that schools and LEAs can easily receive feedback from OSSE, and that OSSE can easily share data with other agencies.
Okay, and so using each of those terms.
Oh, yes.
Can you give an example sort of that usage in the sense that whether OSSE is meeting those standards based on those terms?
Thank you. Sorry, I forgot to answer the second half. So longitudinal, no, not yet. We're not seeing true longitudinal data use as of yet. Portable, there we're looking for feedback back to LEAs and schools. One thing that we committed to in our second SLDS grant were high school feedback reports. These are the most popular in-demand reporting by SEAs to LEAs across the country. It's something we promised and that we haven't done yet. That would be a good example of portable data use. Another example would be the Montana interactive dashboard, where educators and school leaders have user-controlled access to create their own reports. Doesn't require them to make their own code or app, which is some of the functioning that we have right now, but it's all readily available, and they can produce the reporting that they want. And that is not something that we have right now. And in terms of interoperable and sharing with other agencies, we are sharing right now with Health and Human Services type of data, particularly around at-risk status, for example. But we need, as we've mentioned, more of that to complete post-secondary, workforce, earnings, criminal justice, and other agency collaboration.
Okay, perfect. That's going to help me context when I talk to OSSE regarding that context. Another, you explained X codes earlier. What's different with how OSSE has used them and how they're being used in other states?
Yes, basically you don't have reliable enrollment information unless you have the entry and the exit, and because we need to know exactly how long a student is enrolled in each school. Without that, it requires you to make assumptions on multiple other parts of your required reporting and analysis. For example, we have to figure out where to attribute students for accountability purposes. Which school do they belong to? So we look to figure out where do they meet a full academic year definition. And you can see, in our audit, we use OSSE's own data notes and methods in their reporting to show that they are making assumptions in order to figure out where to attribute students to schools because they're missing exit codes.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. So what data elements, I guess, does OSSE collect and report federally, but they don't report locally?
Yeah, I would say our teacher data is the biggest category. The other one that I mentioned is the civil rights data collection. And that one does have some staff collection as well. Also discipline, and it has, I think people might remember seclusion and restraint. There were a number of media articles about this in the past few years. That's all coming from the CRDC collection, as well as having things like guidance counselors available in schools, AP and IB course access and opportunity. It is a data collection that only occurs every 2 years.
Okay. And I want to get to this big question about a statewide student information system, or SIS, and sort of get to the bottom of, whether do we have this right now in terms of steps we can take to institute one. We need to kind of determine if we have one, and if so, why or not. So in your opinion, based on a report, does the district have a statewide student information system right now? And if not, why not?
Now, there is some confusion around that term. Some people use it to mean a student information system that is designed for LEAs and that you offer to them for free from your state education agency. We do have that. What we are talking about is a state level system that's designed for a state education agency for them to use for themselves. That's what we're missing.
Okay. And so what are some steps we can take to institute one? Why is it important to have the state system versus something just for LEAs?
Well, thank you. Sorry.
You're good.
One of those students you were talking about, I think.
Sorry about that. Most states have either created or purchased a statewide SIS. Now they're so common that it's easiest to purchase an off-the-shelf system, and there's a variety of different modules and add-ons you can get. Many states and districts require busing modules or lunch modules, something like this. So they're quite easy to engage with a vendor and get something that has definitions, protocols, and processes already built in, so that it's harder to mess those up.
Okay, perfect. See, there were so many questions around terms and what they mean, and I think that's going to be the crux of some of our conversation is what we understand them to mean. So I really appreciate you clarifying those, Ms. Roth. Auditor Patterson, I want to come to you. I know we were a part of that 2015 National Academy of Science peer evaluation, and so What progress in terms of data collection and governance have you seen from OSSE since the publication of the National Academy Evaluation in 2015?
We've actually published that just a matter of weeks after I took this job, but the office did administer that contract. Some of the things that we have seen during the course of the audit that have been improvements, we've seen them issue a data privacy policy, which was something we needed at the outset of this audit. So they did issue that last fall. We've seen them, some of their data collections have improved. We can say with more confidence that we have full enrollment numbers since 2016, but not prior to 2016. So that's an improvement. Another thing that the council required some years ago were unique teacher identifiers. And there had been unique identifiers, but they changed every year, which sort of lost the purpose. And so starting this past year, they're going to unique identifiers that remain unique identifiers and stay with the teachers. So those are some of the steps forward that we identified during the course of the audit.
Okay.
I'm less familiar with what happened between, say, 2015 and 2019.
Okay. And so with 60 seconds left, I'm going to ask two questions in one. That's how I get around this. The first recommendation from that 2015 study was for the district to build a comprehensive data warehouse, including data about learning conditions in all public schools, their students, school climate, safety and facilities, and academic supports for learning. Has OSSE built such a warehouse? And the second recommendation was to establish institutional arrangements to support ongoing independent evaluation of our public education system. And this will most likely take the form of the new research practice partnership of the Urban Institute. What advice do you have for the Urban Institute as it begins that work?
I think the second first. I think that the most important thing to do immediately is to stand up the community advisory panel, because it's the citizens that are supposed to be developing the research agenda. And I think that's the most critical part. The council, I think the council chairman names people, each of the major unions names someone, the mayor names, so that needs to be stood up to develop the research plan. In terms of have we developed the comprehensive data that we need? No. That's why we're talking about an SLDS, because that has a greater level of definition around it than referring to a warehouse or any other terminology. And I think if you went back to the folks on that panel and asked them, they would also say, no, we haven't done what they were intending.
Thank you so much. I believe that's my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Henderson for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Ms. Patterson and Ms. Roth. I just want to start with a basic question, kind of pulling off of what Councilmember Lewis George was talking about. What is your definition of a data warehouse? Because I feel like we've been having this debate in this city for quite some time.
When the concept of a data warehouse was committed to legislation in 2007, keep in mind that's the same year that the SLDS grant program was created. I think we should probably stop using that term because there is no clear definition.
Okay.
The reason we have been talking about a statewide longitudinal data system is there is a definition that the U.S. Department of Education has given it a definition. There are 18 basic elements. We know more. We can sort of know it when we see it, where a warehouse is a much fuzzier concept.
Okay, because I was like, I mean, I feel like we are using warehouse, longitudinal system, like using some of these terminologies interchangeably when they actually mean very different things. So I will stop using the data warehouse terminology and we'll just stick to the other things that have definitions. In your report, you talked about how in lieu of exercising authority, OSSE has created burdensome and unreliable workarounds. And that kind of triggered for me because I remember when we started collecting student discipline data back in 2013, and it was a negotiation with our charter LEAs, and they didn't want to provide the information directly to OSSE. They felt comfortable providing it to the public charter school board, and then public charter school board, then providing it to OSSE. That was years ago. What my question is to your knowledge, what are these workarounds that are still existing? Because my understanding from OSSE is that as it relates to student discipline data, that practice has stopped. Are there other areas where we also need to probe a little further?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by workaround. So let me ask Erin if she can speak to that in terms of, But are you talking about because charters don't want to provide data, or because OSSE, what we found is that OSSE has declined to request data. So
I'm quoting from your report on page 5. It says, in lieu of exercising authority, OSSE creates burdensome and unreliable workarounds. So I'm assuming that you were talking about these pass-throughs through what I think a couple of times the report may have referred to as like a third-party pass-through.
I think one of the examples is we had a contract for a long time with the New Teacher Project, and they collected teacher information, and then some of it was passed along and some of it wasn't, and not all the charter LEAs participated. I think that was one of the examples. But let me ask Erin if she has other examples to share with you to be responsive to the question.
Okay.
Sure, that's the other big example which has shifted. There's been a couple positive shifts in the last year of the audit, which was great. But it is the reason that we recommend that statewide student information system, so that we have one centralized mechanism to collect everything, and that we don't have any more ad hoc collection systems. One thing that you would typically collect in a either that OSSE could collect right now in their ADT or a statewide SIS, absolutely. One of those exit codes at the end of the year is graduation. We're not collecting graduation or end of the year dropouts in our in one centralized place right now. So that would be a big improvement.
Okay, so some people though would question, how is it possible that we're not collecting information on graduation rates and yet OSSE is the one that certifies a diploma?
It's not that we're not collecting it at all. We're not collecting it via the same centralized place. So it's the process more than the lack of information. You asked about the workarounds. So that's
okay.
Yeah.
So one question that I did have, so the number of LEAs that we have across the city, each of them are using their own separate systems around attendance, student data collection, et cetera. In other jurisdictions where they have a large number of charter schools, let's take New York, for instance, they have a similar issue in terms of getting all of their LEAs to use the exact same system. And often what we have in DC is that, someone will say, well, the School Reform Act gives us the independent authority to be able to do this on our own. What is I know that's not your job, but like in terms of the function, how does your report sort of respond to that?
One of the things we do make note of is the fact that the Office of the State Superintendent, or SEA, clearly has the authority to request data from charter LEAs. That's clear, that's in the law. There's really no dispute about that. What is possible is for them to use different systems for their own information. And Erin spoke to this a little while ago in terms of some of the charter LEAs have a student information system. We're recommending a state level student information system, that there could be a module that a charter LEA could use or get or buy or whatever. But we're not saying that they have to have a specific data collection system at the LEA level.
Okay, no, but I know, but here's my question in terms of how that works, because one of the things that was a criticism in the report of OSSE is that some of the data is not collected automatically. Like it's not drawn just straight from the system in the same way that they do attendance now. So if I have my own system over here and they have their own system over here and we have an SIS, technically the LEA is still going to have to upload its particular data. Is that not good practice, or am I missing something?
No, that is good practice.
Okay. But
yeah, it's fine. Sorry, go ahead.
No. Okay. I just want to sort of clarify. One of the other things that was kind of stuck out to me in the report was the assertion around that OSSE is not in compliance with the U.S. Department of Education right now. To your knowledge, has OSSE received any communications from US DOE about non-compliance with federal grants or requirements?
We're not aware of anything that's specific in terms of non-compliance, but one of the things that we note as auditors is whenever we're at risk of being dinged, and the fact that we haven't yet been dinged, we still have to note that there is that risk. And one of the conversations that we had a little while ago had to do with the in-school suspension issue, where we I think we're pretty clearly out of compliance and not providing all the information that the department has requested, but we have not yet been criticized for that.
Okay. Earlier, one of my colleagues asked about the National Student Clearinghouse data. And I think you noted that the clearinghouse prohibits the publication of its data, or sort of the back end sharing, the reverse sharing. Is your stance that OSSE could release this information on their own without the approval of the clearinghouse?
That's not quite accurate.
Okay.
But so yes, most states have this same contract. They have a pretty standard contract. Some states have a little bit of different pieces and parts on it. But what states use it for is those, in particular, those high school feedback reports. So that high schools know exactly what's happening to their graduates when they go through post-secondary. And that's perfectly fine for the state education agency to use. That's why they get the data to use it. What's important is that the data that a state education agency gives to NSC, that is longitudinal. It isn't just like a snapshot of graduates, but we have to be giving them good data for them to link and give us back good data. But then we can absolutely share it back out with stakeholders.
Okay, so the issue with it there was a sort of around the longitudinal piece of it, not necessarily the lack of information.
I don't know what the NSC data that OSSE is getting back, looks like in full right now, but I know what it includes and what they're not yet reporting on. So we want to see those persistence and post-secondary graduation stats as well that we have and can share. Okay.
In my last little bit here, I just have some quick questions about process for this audit. Not all of it was done in-house. You guys contracted out with a vendor?
Yes.
Okay. And so did that require you having to, I guess, share any of the data sets that you received from OSSE?
Yes, we went through a very exhaustive procedure of negotiating a data sharing agreement that we then had to renew on many occasions. But all of the data was shared with the contractor, and there were all kinds of protections like non-disclosure agreements and the state of holding of the data, lots of different IT kinds of protections. And one of the things that we're very happy to have been able to negotiate with the attorneys for the executive was the ability to have access to the data over a long period of time in case we get additional questions from you all or from anyone else, so that we can have some amount of access to that over some additional period of time following the publication.
Okay, I'm over time. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Henderson. Thank you, Ms. Patterson. That's going to conclude the questioning of you. So you're excused.
Thank you.
Call the executive witnesses. Thank you for your work on this.
Thank you.
So are you exiting them? Well, they're doing a poor job of it. There we go. Okay, so coming to the table, figuratively speaking, should be Dr. Michelle Walker-Davis, who's the Executive Director of the Public Charter School Board, Paul Kine, who's the Deputy Mayor for Education, and Shauna Young, who is the Interim State Superintendent of the Office of the State Superintendent of Education. Are you all fine if Dr. Walker-Davis starts and then the Deputy Mayor and then Shauna Young? Does that order work? Okay. And is Dr. Walker-Davis here? The hearing can't begin until you join us. Dr. Walker-Davis, you want to start?
Yes, I am here, Council Member Chairman. Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson and members of the Committee of the Whole. I am Dr. Michelle Walker-Davis, Executive Director of the DC Public Charter School Board. Thank you for inviting me to speak today about the ODCA report on education data in the district. Overall, DC PCSB continues to have many concerns about the report's narrative and conclusions. We laid out these concerns in our response to the draft report in December 2020. However, we feel that the final version of the report still mischaracterizes the district's data practices and the relationship between DC PCSB and OSSE. The report lacks crucial historical context about how OSSE has evolved over time and is unique as a state education agency. When I started my career in DC, I was an analyst in the district's Office of Budget and Planning's education branch, where I worked on the very first budgets for the then State Education Office, OSSE's predecessor. When OSSE was created in 2007, I was serving in DCPS and watched as the agency was conceived. Now that I have returned to the district after a 12-year stint in Minneapolis-St. Paul, I can say that today's OSSE is very different from the one I observed back then. As the report notes, the relationship between OSSE and DCPCSB can be atypical at times. It is atypical in part because the education landscape in DC has few, if any, comparable contexts across the country. It would be worthwhile to figure out how any changes would work in our education data system before we create a patchwork from other states. The relationship between DCPCSB and OSSE has developed over the past 14 years and continues to evolve. Multiple portions of the report imply an inappropriate relationship between DCPCSB and OSSE, while leaving out context and reasons why certain data are collected the way they are. For example, the collection of attendance data started with DCPCSB because OSSE did not have the staff nor infrastructure in place in its early years. Over time, with stability at the top, OSSE has built out processes and systems to accommodate this data, and we have, as a result, shifted our collection responsibilities. OSSE has built their systems and processes to strengthen data collection practices while building productive relationships among key stakeholders. As OSSE makes clear in its testimony, there is always room to improve data and technology efforts. OSSE's improvement in this area has been consistent, and they have a robust plan for future progress. Their approach, which has been rooted in reflection and collaboration, is the right one to drive improvements in the district. As OSSE builds both capacity and context, DCPCSB remains committed to supporting and bolstering their growth. A consistent question in the report surrounds DCPCSB's involvement in and access to certain data while overlooking the reasons for that access. There are many data OSSE collects that we also need to use for our authorizing function. To be clear, our staff do not have the ability to edit any of OSSE's data on any metrics. Rather, OSSE makes aggregate data available for DCPCSB and school staff to view only. It makes sense for our staff to have viewing privileges to use metrics like in-seat attendance in our school quality report. Multiple state education agencies validate district data in a similar way. Among other applications, DCPCSB uses our view-only access to ensure that schools submit data in a timely manner and to observe trends within public charter schools. The report suggests that DC needs to fundamentally change education data collection and analysis to be more in line with other states. However, DC is unique in its education landscape, and we cannot assume that systems that work in other jurisdictions will simply plug in and work here. Ultimately, any specific off-the-shelf system will not substantially change the day-to-day operations in schools. Having spent a considerable amount of time working in urban education in Minneapolis-St. Paul, I have seen how useful a well-regarded system such as the one in Minnesota can be. To be clear, what we are discussing today is not a panacea for academic achievement. As a former Chief Accountability Officer, I fully support efforts to improve our data quality and use over time. However, I do not think this is the most pressing issue before us, given the strides already made and an ongoing shared commitment to improvement. I would encourage us to leverage the data we already have to focus on the continued reopening of schools this term, addressing the mental health needs of students, and preparing for in-person instruction in the fall. As students return to classrooms, we need to work to ensure that the education they receive daily is more equitable than it was prior to the pandemic and meeting their needs. By doing this, we will have a powerful impact on the performance of students over time. Before I conclude, I want to make a note of some of the analysis presented in the report. The report reaches many conclusions about student mobility, attendance, and other issues. Unfortunately, DCP-CSB staff do not have access to the specific methodology used to produce these numbers. Therefore, we cannot replicate or verify the report's findings. For example, based on our own analysis, we do not have clear evidence that students leave public charter high schools at higher rates than they leave DCPS high schools. However, as stated in our response, we would appreciate the opportunity to better understand the methodology employed and data use to inform the conclusions cited by the ODCA. We look forward to continued conversation with respect to the data analysis portions. Thank you for allowing me to testify. My colleagues and I are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kine.
Good afternoon, or rather good evening, Chairman Mendelson and members of the Committee of the Whole. I'm Paul Kine, the Deputy Mayor for Education. I'm joined today by Shauna Young, who's the Interim State Superintendent, and you've just heard from Dr. Michelle Walker-Davis, the Executive Director of the DC Public Charter School Board. We're very pleased to be here to testify before you today for this public roundtable on the Auditor's report, Measuring What Matters, More and Better Data Needed to Improve DC Public Schools. The Bowser administration is committed to high quality and actionable data on the performance of our schools for our stakeholders, including parents, policymakers, advocates, and the broader public. Our commitment cannot be understated. We recognize the importance of making policy decisions transparently and based on evidence. As we know, the District of Columbia Education Research Practice Partnership Establishment and Audit Act of 2018 authorized the District of Columbia Auditor to initiate an audit of data management and collection practices of public local education agencies. After the audit began in January 2019, and throughout the 2-year process, my office, along with the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, the District of Columbia Public Schools, and the Public Charter School Board cooperated fully with it, devoting considerable time and resources to its completion. Collectively, these agencies provided more than 1,000 documents to satisfy the auditor's requests. We fulfilled 64 different data requests spanning the 2012-2013 school year to the 2017-18 school year. The audit took hundreds of hours of staff time required for the highly technical work of satisfying data requests, for participation in staff meetings to provide insight to the auditor, as well as for individual staff level interviews. Additionally, we spent considerable time on detailed feedback on a draft of the report, which you can find in the final report's appendix, specifically aimed at contributing to accuracy and balance. Understandably, we've been waiting in anticipation for the publication of this report, and we are pleased that this audit has finally concluded. While this audit persisted for 2 years, we have continued doing the important work of serving district students and families and providing the best education possible, all the while relying on the actionable longitudinal data available through OSSE, and, as you heard mentioned by the auditors team, continuing our improvement journey of that data system. I want to be very clear about some foundational facts. The District of Columbia is in full compliance with grant requirements from the U.S. Department of Education to their satisfaction. We have a statewide longitudinal data system and comply with local laws pertaining to its authorization. We share data back and forth with LEAs to meet their needs. We share more data with the public on the performance of our public schools and provide unprecedented transparency. We satisfy research requests consistent with applicable laws governing student privacy. Furthermore, as a leader of our recovery efforts in this city, I can also share that I have full confidence in the data reporting and analysis we get from OSSE as essential to our collective work to ensure a comprehensive recovery and healing effort for all our students. I would also like to be very clear that none of this means that our systems do not need to be continuously improved and updated. In fact, we've been very clear with this council and others over the past several years where we are on OSSE's impressive data improvement journey. We consistently identify and invest in improvements to our data systems so we can make more information available to stakeholders with the purpose of improving student outcomes. We look forward to making additional advances to satisfy our commitment to accurate, accessible, and actionable data. These advances will further support our efforts to address student needs as we continue to fight this pandemic and recover. Thank you very much for hosting this hearing and for the opportunity to share information with you today. We are pleased to be afforded the opportunity to describe the progress we have made to improve our data systems and supports. I will now turn it over to Shauna Young and will be available for questions.
Ms. Young.
Thank you. And my conversation today will be accompanied by a presentation that I think is getting ready to go. Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson and members of the Committee of the Whole. I am Shauna Young, the Interim State Superintendent of Education. I'm pleased to testify before you today for this public hearing on the District of Columbia Auditor's Report, Measuring What Matters, More and Better Data Needed to Improve DC Public Schools. Thank you for the opportunity to share more about the history of our education data systems and our current capacity for collecting and sharing critical information about our students. This story is one of growth and progress, accomplished together over many years with collaboration across government, schools, and our families. Not only have we invested in systems, but we have used information over time to become the fastest improving state in the nation in student outcomes. OSSE has a deep belief and commitment to this work, as data have been a key pillar of our strategic plan first published 6 years ago. We have shared our vision, including both our needs and our progress, with this council and the public transparently over time. We believe that this work is critical to fulfilling our mission to sustain, accelerate, and deepen educational progress in the district, especially for those who are furthest behind. This work is even more urgent as we muster all available resources to support schools in recovery of unfinished learning caused by the pandemic. My testimony aims to provide important context on this report. First, I will describe the efforts that OSSE has taken to build our statewide data systems, because it is critical to appreciate where we started and the progress we have made during this time. Second, I will describe the status of our data collection systems and processes. Finally, I will outline where we are headed in the future so that we can deliver on the objectives promised in our strategic plan. By the culmination of our time together this afternoon, I believe you will understand the complexity of this work and continued confidence in our ability to do it. Part 1, historic efforts. The story of our data systems is one of progress. As we advance statehood for the district, we must remember that we did not have a state education agency prior to 2007. Our journey has required significant collaboration across multiple mayors, with investments improved by the council over multiple budget cycles, with collaboration from LEAs and agencies across the district to contribute to education data from birth to adulthood. This journey has been documented publicly in our annual performance oversight materials, budget hearings, and prior public testimonies before council. It has taken many years to build our data systems, which collect and share important information on student outcomes. It is important to understand that story to engage in meaningful and constructive conversation on our progress and the path forward. Prior to OSSE, the State Education Office was located within DCPS. Early into OSSE's existence in 2007, the agency received a set of federal grants for a statewide longitudinal data system and a grant from Race to the Top. These investments laid the foundation for the primary data system that we have today, the Statewide Longitudinal Education Data System, or SLED, which is the statewide data repository that collects information from LEA student information systems. When the Bowser administration began in 2015, we had a clear vision about the role data should play in our work. Actionable data has been a key pillar in our strategy since the very beginning, and we knew that while the foundation was laid, there were significant needs that had to be met in order to get where we need to go as a district. We carefully prioritized our time and resources to ensure that we were making meaningful improvements. We made small but essential investments in things such as server capacity, so we could store and process the data we were collecting. To support efficient linkages between LEA SIS and statewide data systems, we procured a district-wide student information system, or state SIS. We made the SIS available to all LEAs to use free of charge. Today, 18 LEAs use this system as their primary local SIS, while all LEAs use it to submit certain administrative data, such as contact information for school officials. We built data applications or software programs that help support the efficient collection of data. For example, work of this nature helped us modernize our outdated practice of conducting a physical headcount for our annual enrollment audit to an online process. OSSE took another significant step forward by requiring all LEAs to use automated data transfer for certain reporting. Automated data transfer replaced manual reporting processes. It allows for the automatic routine movement of data from the LEA data system to OSSE's system. Implementing this transition helped build more quality controls around our data reporting. We also invested early in data quality and access, deploying the first data access and visualization applications to help LEAs better manage their data, more effectively share it back to them, and allow them to see in real time how the data they sent were being reported. These look like dashboards, allowing LEAs to examine trends based on their students' data, providing comparisons over time, and allowing LEA staff to drill down into the data at the student level. This includes things like looking at attendance trends, demographic trends, or even outcomes. For example, we have a 9th grade outcomes app that allows middle school staff key data about how their students are doing in their respective high schools. OSSE has also expanded the district's data collection capacity significantly over time, adding data on student attendance, school faculty and staff, and student discipline. We have also coordinated with other district agencies, such as the Department of Human Services, DC Health, and others to collect and share other information about our students in order to direct and provide critical services. For example, we work with DHS and its contractor to track data on students experiencing homelessness so schools can provide critical services to children and their families. Each new collection requires careful technical planning and close coordination with LEAs to share expectations, provide assistance to build infrastructure and compliance, and to receive feedback on what reporting is most helpful to our educator to drive changes in practice. We do not collect data for the sake of having more data, and we know that each piece of information we have is actually submitted by the staff at our schools, who often have multiple roles and heavy workloads. We have recognized our responsibility to not redirect resources from student support to administrative functions. It is a difficult balance to strike and one we must do in partnership with our educators. This intense partnership and collaboration has resulted in some of the most robust reporting across the nation on students and schools. An example of this is our DC school report card, published for the first time in 2018, which, informed by stakeholders, presented statewide, common, transparent, comparable information across DCPS and charter schools. DC was proud to be one of the few states in the country to drive equity by weighting and reporting data on specific groups of students, such as by race, at-risk, and disability status, to clearly see where we need to focus our resources to help students learn. The work in collecting, sharing data is not a one-time effort, and the work is never done. We must continuously upgrade our infrastructure to match our ambitions, and we have made significant strides to revamp and revitalize our agency structure to support this work. None of us are using the same cell phone or laptop we had in 2007. So too have we updated our data systems over time, and we must continue to do so. We have created a detailed 4-year plan to standardize, streamline, and automate our end-to-end data functions from collection through reporting. These efforts will improve the experiences of LEA staff and OSSE staff who work in these areas, and we are beginning to implement this plan. We were pleased that in fiscal year 2021 budget, the council moved up the remaining capital project funding for this data infrastructure work from 23 to 21, so we could begin to execute this plan immediately. Part 2, present efforts. As you know, the data we collect reflect what is happening in the life of a student each day. Most data are collected and entered into a SIS by an educator or member of school staff. Now, I would like to transition to give you an idea of the landscape of district education today and how we use data. The district's education data are longitudinal and portable. When students enter the education system, we assign them their first unique student identifier, and that information travels in their record throughout their education in the district. Using that unique student identifier, we attach many different data points to a student throughout their journey in our schools. For example, enrollment, attendance, and assessment scores. A teacher or school leader has access to information about their students through their own school level SIS. And through data shared back from OSSE and SLED and its tools, An LEA leader can see both LEA trends and student level data related to all key data submitted to OSSE. Allow me to be a little bit more descriptive of this capacity. Last week, during our performance oversight hearing, I was asked about the longitudinal data for students who attended Washington Metropolitan High School. When students enrolled in Washington Met, their electronic records carried with them information on historic enrollment, attendance patterns, and assessment results. These records also move with the students if and when they enrolled in another school. When school leaders plan, they can look at this data to guide them in what kind of instructional supports or other interventions to plan. For example, OSSE makes available reports that show LEAs a preview of their incoming enrollees who are students with disabilities or English learners through a suite of reporting called early access applications. This helps schools prepare to support students on the first day of school by making sure that educators have information on the accommodations needed for the student to access course material effectively. Another piece of evidence of this longitudinal data are the many research analyses that OSSE has published detailing student outcomes over time. For example, we have published a first of its kind students with disabilities landscape analysis, reports on graduation rates over time, reports on post-secondary pathways, and many of our STAR and report card metrics, such as re-enrollment, which also provides longitudinal views of specific student groups reported over multiple years. The district's education data are transparent. OSSE publicly reports an extremely large volume of the data that it collects. Either through federal or local compliance efforts or through public reports, OSSE reports more data on the performance of the district schools than ever before, leading to an unprecedented level of transparency. You may find a listing of the data reports that we release on our website. OSSE provides downloadable spreadsheets on our statewide assessment. We publish the DC school report card and provide downloadable files containing all metrics that appear on the site. OSSE also publishes an extensive volume of reports to comply with our statutory requirements from this council. In addition to being transparent by publicly reporting, OSSE is clear regarding the sources and methods behind its disclosures. In our public data files, we include data notes that describe the source and methodology for reporting, as well as any caveats or demonstrated anomalies. When we publish the STAR ratings, we concurrently publish an extensive technical guide that provides a deep look into our statewide school accountability system and our methods, providing a level of transparency unmatched by most states. When we note that DC has been the fastest improving city in the country on academic measures, we cite results on the Trial Urban District Assessment and the National Assessment for Educational Progress. Finally, beyond publishing data transparently, OSSE highlights accomplishments in our reports, but also continues to address and deeply examine some of the most challenging issues facing public education in the district. We have conducted extensive analysis on attendance, for example, work that looks at the relationship with attendance and distance to school, attendance and acts of violence, attendance and having a sibling, attendance and being suspended, and much more. And we published our educator workforce report, responding to public desire to have more of this data, which provided the first statewide look at the status of our teachers across the district. The district's education data are compliant with applicable laws. OSSE is following local laws as they relate to the functionality of our systems. Specifically, DC Code 38-2609 authorizes OSSE to develop and implement a longitudinal educational data warehouse system. This system exists. We work in it and with it every day. It is a dynamic system that is constantly evolving and improving. OSSE's current data system meets the functionality that is required in the statute. The district is following federal laws and is and has been in compliance with applicable federal grant requirements. The U.S. Department of Education recently issued a letter restating this and reconfirming our successful completion of our grants to their satisfaction. Any allegation that OSSE is out of federal compliance is inappropriate, irresponsible, and risky. It could potentially jeopardize the federal funds that support our schools and at-risk children, or open the district to meritless litigation. The district's education data are high quality. Beyond compliance with local and federal laws and grants, we have developed a robust data governance system, which is a set of policies that document how data are collected and shared. These systems and processes ensure quality at all phases of the data lifecycle, from collection to reporting. Over the past 6 years, we have centralized and collected more of this data and strengthened our policies and oversight of LEAs. We set reporting standards that are applicable to all schools and set up systems of oversight and compliance. For example, We reject records and require corrections when they do not conform to our standards for pieces of data, such as when a student's record is submitted without corresponding demographic information. We also have a system of reflecting a whole range of other possible errors back to the LEA for corrections. We have staff devoted to helping LEAs fix problems when they can't. We also have multiple points in the year where LEAs review and certify their data or calculations that are created from their data. To reduce or eliminate human error and technical glitches, we have implemented a system of checks to ensure data accuracy and compliance. The district's education data are informed by stakeholder feedback pertaining to what data to collect and how to collect them. Through robust and extensive public engagement with stakeholders, we ask what data would be most meaningful and how it should be displayed to make the most sense. For example, when we created the My Child Care DC website, which shares profiles on our childcare providers, we met with providers and families to ask what information would be valuable to them. We engaged with schools and business partners in the development of our career and technical education state plan. For our STAR framework and the DC school report card, we engaged with teachers, principals, ward education councils, the State Board of Education, families, and students. OSSE heard from more than 4,000 parents and community members whose voices helped guide the development of the DC school report card. I have spoken in front of groups of stakeholders, explained our plans, answered tough questions, taken tough and creative feedback to heart, and carried that feedback to our teams for implementation. Frequently, this resulted in changes to our original plans, such as when we added years of teacher experience to the DC school report card or changed proposed metric weights in the STAR framework. We have been cited nationally for the time and investment we make in this important work of authentic engagement. A 2019 report by the Data Quality Campaign entitled Empowering Families with Data, How Washington, D.C. Engaged Stakeholders to Build Its D.C. School Report Card, noted D.C.'s strong commitment across city leaders and CBOs to connect with families and hear their ideas for the D.C. School Report Card, adding, OSSE leaders took what could have been a basic compliance exercise and turned it into a meaningful opportunity to cultivate relationships throughout the city, which is ultimately the goal of any type of stakeholder engagement. This valuable feedback informs our work and makes it better. The district's education data are accessible. OSSE not only makes a large amount of data public and transparent, but we also make it accessible. That is, we work to make it available to the people who need it in ways they can actually use and understand. For research, OSSE partners with governmental and non-governmental entities to conduct independent research and analysis, and we are well on our way to establishing the District of Columbia Education Research Practice Partnership. Over the past year, we published the notice of invitation and managed the application and selection processes as required by law. We are currently in the process of drafting the master services agreement with the selected partner for the collaborative, the Urban Institute, and members of the advisory committee are being selected both inside and outside of the government. We are looking forward to fully actualizing the vision that many of you had for a true independent education research practice partnership, free from government influence and politics, and reflective of the diversity of viewpoints across the district. This is truly an exciting time for our work with significant potential for the future. For schools and LEAs, we not only collect and make available statewide data and data on school students, we've also built multiple dashboards and visualizations. We create pre-populated reports and analyses, and we host trainings and communities of practice with educators. We are responsive to feedback we hear from educators and incorporate it when we create new reporting and data sharing mechanisms. For example, we have specific data sharing and programming for a group of schools who are supporting students from 8th to 9th grade transition. Finally, for the public, in addition to producing the extensive research and reporting described earlier, we work extremely hard to ensure that our tools are accessible to everyone in the district. We do extensive user testing with families on our websites to ensure that they are intuitive and user-friendly, and we make them mobile accessible. Our vital materials are translated into all the languages required by the Language Access Act. We ensure that the language we use is clear and understandable. We create videos, guides, user tools, and printable reports. All these actions help us fulfill our goal to share and use actionable data, not only to inform policy decisions, but also to empower our partners to improve and build community understanding. Part 3, future efforts. Our work is far from done. We want to know more. We want to be able to share information with those who are best positioned to act. We want modern, efficient systems that allow us to spend less time on querying data and more time on turning research and analysis into action. OSSE has a plan to continue our progress by updating our data infrastructure, improving our data collection, and increasing reporting and sharing. While purchase of off-the-shelf systems can be a tempting recommendation to solve a big technology concern, we are confident that our multi-year plan for infrastructure upgrade is more effective, more efficient with district-wide investments, and less disruptive to our schools, which are focusing on learning recovery. To further modernize our data systems, we have capital and operating plans to continue our existing efforts. We will improve our data collection environment by implementing new standards, investing in cloud technologies and modern data management, dissemination, and analytical tools. We will re-engineer OSSE's data architecture by leveraging the best mix of Okto's on-premises, cloud, and shared services. In terms of data sharing and research, we have built our capacity to collect and report more data, including such data as teacher workforce and retention, and have been in the planning stages for comprehensive course code collection. We are in the exciting process of working with the Research Practice Partnership to significantly expand and advance research that can inform what happens in our schools. We must also continue to focus our efforts on using the information we have to drive improvement. As we know, the district faces significant challenges as we respond and recover from this pandemic. We must do everything we can to make sure that the hard-fought progress we've made in student achievement is not reversed. Data are a necessary part of that effort, but data alone would be insufficient and will not on their own increase student outcomes. Over the course of the next year, OSSE will be analyzing outcomes for the new instructional models that our students have experienced. We will look at attendance and discipline outcomes. We will support our schools in evaluating and reevaluating the needs of students with disabilities. We will require, evaluate, and approve LEA's continuous education plans for reopening and learning recovery in the next year, including requiring schools to identify how they will assess student learning. We will support schools in implementing evidence-based academic interventions. All of that pales in comparison to the work our educators will do every day in the classroom to ensure that each of our students is served both academically and with social supports. We must continue to focus our time, energy, and resources in helping our teachers and leaders serve our children. It is clear that our story is one of great collaboration across all levels of government, schools, and community. We have made enormous progress together over time. OSSE itself has come a long way, and I'm proud of the talented team we've assembled at the agency. The reality is that much of the reporting and analysis that we currently do would not have been possible a few short years ago, and we make more information available than ever to improve student outcomes. DC is a unique city with unique needs, and we have built our systems to accommodate those needs. Our data processes and systems have leapt forward significantly, but these systems will never be perfect or finished, and they will be continuously improved. We share the urgency that the DC Council and other city leaders feel to not only help our schools recover quickly and address learning loss, but to advance student learning to be even better than it was before. We must get there, not by throwing away years of progress, but by building on that progress and focusing on a future that we all want to see, a future where our schools serve all our students and all students are prepared to achieve in school and in life. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Young. So there may only be one round, not sure, one round of questions, 2-minute round from members. And I will begin. I'm going to begin with a question I asked of Auditor Patterson. It's a very basic question. Why does the auditor say that you do not have a state longitudinal data system when you are emphatic that you do? How can we reconcile the opposing viewpoints? Ms. Young?
Thank you. Well, I can share the definition of what a longitudinal data system is and explain how our system meets that definition. So the U.S. Department of Education defines a statewide longitudinal data system as one that collects and maintains detailed, high-quality student and staff level data that are linked across entities and over time, providing a complete academic and performance history for each student. So our data systems in the district collect and maintain detailed data on our students. We have data quality and governance protocols in place. And further, these data are linked across entities and over time. So we meet the definition of that system as well as the functionalities that we've talked about today.
Meet the definition, but I'm not sure. Well, that would explain why you would argue that you have the system. Maybe then it's an issue of robustness of the system. Do you disagree with the auditor? I'm looking at her statement. What we don't collect, student courses, credits and grades and so forth. What we collect only in part, student enrollment by program type, for example. Do you disagree with that?
Let me share with you some, yes, we do disagree in the characterization of the collection of the data that we have. We collect enrollment, demographics, attendance, discipline, APIB participation, assessments, IEP data, the status of our EL and SPED students, report card framework data, enrollment, among other things that we collect at the local level. And this data, as we've talked about, I talked about in my testimony, follows the student individually, is attached to their individual student record, and is shared back and forth between our districts and us and with other users of the system. So we collect, as I mentioned, a robust amount of information about students. There is information that we do not currently collect, but our system exists as a longitudinal data system and meets those definitions by what we collect, how we share it, and how we use it to support our students.
Now, the auditor recommended that we consider legislation. They would revise the 2007 legislation. I think we're getting feedback on your end. That would revise the 2007 legislation to require more specifically, I think the number was 18 data. Now, maybe it's a different number. Should we do that, or is it sufficient that you're going to look at where you are looking at where there could be more or better data collection, and you do that without legislation?
I'm unfamiliar with the specific proposal that you're talking about, but I think broadly, our goal from the beginning has been to build a system that is capable of collecting and reporting safely and transparently and with efficiency a large volume of student data. And we have done that over time. We have collected over time more robustly enrollment data, attendance data, discipline data. We have begun a teacher data collection. And as I mentioned earlier, we're in the process of planning for several other collections. And so we're confident that we are building the systems to collect data, to collect the data we do have and share it back, as well as to collect more data over time, which is certainly a goal of ours overall, to continue to improve and grow our collections to be supportive of our educators.
Well, let me approach this from a variation, and that is an early warning system. The 2012 district law requires that the district have an early warning system whereby the district can track students and alert educators when a student is at risk of not being on grade level or falling behind and so forth. The auditor says in her report that no early warning system exists. Why has the district not created an early warning system? Now, my understanding is that in your response to the auditor's report, OSSE said that an early warning system is better suited at an LEA than at the state education agency level. Why? Would it not be better suited at the state level where you have more information about a student that cuts across all of the LEAs that a student has ever attended? I think part of the issue here is we have a high degree of mobility in the district. So that was kind of a compounded question.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. So there's a couple of different questions that you asked there, so I'll try and address them each. So first, when we talk about early warning system, what we're talking about is a grouping of information that that faculty and staff use in school to identify how to support students who may be at risk. So we know that this work is actually going on right now in our LEAs and districts. Our schools are taking the information, both that they have in their local student information system, as well as the information that is collected and shared back to them statewide through OSSE's data systems, to identify students who are at risk at any given moment and figure out what interventions are appropriate to provide them to help them get back on track. We've heard district leaders talk about this. Sometimes this is called, the systems that are the processes that school and educators use to do this are called MTSS, multi-tiered systems of supports, which are informed by the data that goes into any given system. Sometimes those systems exist already in the modules in a local education agencies in a district student information system. And sometimes those are informed by statewide averages or data, such as data OSSE has collected and reported previously about risk factors contributing to things like attendance or discipline over time. So we actually know that the work of educators taking information and data and supporting their students in a process of providing them interventions is happening now. So that data exists in the district. It exists on several different levels. What we pointed out in response to whether or not that investment is prudent in the district, very frequently these do relate to are focused in a local district, because that local school or system has access to a very significant amount of education that is very hyper localized to a student, right? And that information may or may not be the most efficient to collect back up at the central and be pushed back down. It's hyper local to a school's grading policies or discipline policies, what the relationships a student might have in a school building, or other types of contacts and information that could be collected at that time.
So that speaks to why you think it's adequate at the LEA level. But it is true that there's data, that students have data that cuts across multiple LEAs. And an LEA would not, a single LEA, the current LEA would not likely have all that data.
So the districts, the information of a student that a student has is portable, which means a school who has a student enrolled would be able to see that student's past enrollment data and demographic and assessment data. And so there is data that is portable with the student that goes with the student if and where they move. And the work of an early warning system is to look at how that student is performing or achieving or behaving in that year, and to see in what way that indicates a different intervention could be shared. There are certain kinds of predictive analytics that is one way of creating an early warning system that can use historical data of large groups of students to attempt to predict what an individual student would do. That is a methodology that does exist in some early warning systems.
But not in ours at this point.
I would say that we publish a bunch significant data about DC students that would inform schools in identifying how to address a student intervention. For example, our attendance reports have indicated that a pattern of attendance in the first month of school can be predictive of future absenteeism. That's a piece of information that our students, that our schools can use to help identify students in need.
I'm near the end of my time. I'm going to ask this question because I think it's important that you are able to respond to this. The auditor states in her report that OSSE refused to send the last year of data for 2019. Why did OSSE refuse to do so?
So the scope of the audit was for 6 years of data. and OSSE complied with sending 6 years of data. OSSE complied with the scope of the audit to provide the 6 years of data to the auditor.
That's the end of your answer?
So the auditor subsequently requested a 7th year of data. At the time that was requested, the OSSE was in the middle of a conversation with the auditor and the U.S. Department of Education related to a FERPA compliance matter, and so therefore did not extend the scope of the audit beyond the 6 years that was originally requested.
Was Department of Education involved in that decision?
The Department of Education was involved with the conversation with OSSE and the auditor related to the FERPA matter.
Okay. Let me turn to my colleagues. Robert White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our agency leaders. I appreciate you being here and responding to the auditor's report. Let me start with, because I'm not clear on the early warning intervention. So what specific information does OSSE have or schools have on individual students that would give an early warning?
So OSSE has access to data related to the full suite of a student's academic and other type of demographic history. As I mentioned, I think it's in one of our exhibits as well. We have citywide enrollment, demographics, attendance, discipline, assessments, IEP and English learner status, different types of report card and framework data, and as well as school-wide data, faculty and staff, enrollment audit, and other types of data. For a school, for a student level at a school, for a student level at a school has access to the entirety of their of that data for their current students.
Okay.
They also see the history of enrollment for individual students, demographics, and assessment, including AP/IB participation and the IEP data for that student over time.
So I understand your answer to mean that information for an early warning system is there, but is there an early warning system? Are there any data points that trigger a warning to a teacher or administrator that say we need to intervene here?
Mostly that work is done at the local school level because the local school level has more information that can contribute to that. OSSE does not single out and set flags only based on attendance data, for example, to send to LEAs. It does provide real-time reporting to LEAs that says, here is the status of your students, so that we provide sort of like user-friendly dashboards that can make that work easier. But LEAs may have different triggers at that level, and many of the schools have such systems in their student information systems, and some use a different type of collaborative process across their school.
It's how do you measure student progress?
In which realm?
What do you mean, which realm?
So I think we measure student progress, and I would say we measure student outcomes in our schools in a number of ways, and we collect them in different ways. At the state level, as we've had a significant amount of conversation about lately, one way we do that is statewide assessment scores. We also, as we talked about, do significant reporting on attendance and discipline. We mark progress on a student's individualized education plan. And help provide that information to educators to track that progress. Those are some of the ways that we identify and track student progress, as well as we talk about in the statewide, in the school report card, AP and IB data, participation, and outcomes on the SAT, as well as post-secondary enrollment.
Right. And if the assessment test changes, how do you continue to track progress?
So assessments live in a student record, over time. So that data never goes away. We would have the assessment records for students from the first time that they took that, and they would retain in the student's longitudinal record over time.
So based on the data you collect, can you tell what the outcomes are for let's say Black students by various categories? So, but let me ask it differently. Based on the data you have, what can you tell me about outcomes for Black students?
Sure. We report our outcomes on all data points that we collect on the STAR framework and disaggregated by student, race, and other specific kinds of student groups by school. So for each outcome, and not only by school, but also by LEA and at the state level. So we're able to say a number and percentage of students performing at different rates on the state assessment, the number and percentage of students at different attendance and discipline rates, as well as all the other metrics that are disaggregable. And those are not only on the website, but we provide downloadable data files to do that as well.
Okay, so do you have data on Black students by income, by family income?
We have the proxy for that would be whether or not the student was at risk. Mm-hmm.
At risk.
We have at risk and not at risk breakdowns.
At risk of what?
The definition for at risk that is in the DC statute, which relates to TANF SNAP eligibility, homelessness, students experiencing homelessness in the care of CFSA and/or overage.
Okay.
So that is a metric that we use commonly across multiple different reporting frameworks in the district, including through our funding mechanisms. So we have sort of comparability of those measures across multiple different ways we use the data.
Okay, so we don't have income on, let's say, Black students by income only if they are are all the at-risk categories clumped together, or is it separated?
At-risk categories are reported as one category, but we don't collect citywide income data for our families in the education cluster.
All right, so we don't know the relationship for outcomes for Black students between for family income.
We can discuss, and we have discussed the outcomes of any specific group of student that we report on, based on at risk or not at risk, which is the at risk is the district's proxy in the education sector for low income in many cases.
All right. So what income? So outcomes for students and families making $30,000 a year, Black students versus Black student and a family making $80,000 a year. Do we know the difference?
I'd have to actually go back and look. The definition for the income for at-risk is based on TANF and SNAP, which are federally determined rates of income, but I don't have that right off the top of my head, so I'm sure we could identify that.
Do you think this is something that would be important to drill down on, given the outcomes for Black students?
I think there is a pretty large body of information that says students of higher incomes of any race tend to have stronger educational and attendance and other types of outcomes than students who are in lower incomes. That reflects what we know about structural poverty and its impact on some student outcomes. And so I do think that knowing the proxy for lower income versus higher income is important.
So so could we compare the outcomes for Black students and families making $100,000 compared to white students and families making $100,000 to understand if they have similar education outcomes?
I would not be able to disaggregate anything beyond the at-risk status, which is the data we collect that's the proxy for lower income across all students in the district. We could combine, we certainly have that data available about students who are at risk by specific other type of demographic and students who are not at risk by that demographic.
I think that is important data to collect, given the outcome data for not just Black students, Latino students, English language learners, students with special needs. I do think that we need more refined data because we can't solve the problem of such vastly disparate outcomes without drilling down, I think, on these and saying, why is this happening? Do you agree with that?
I agree that having data is helpful. I think that we have a robust amount of information now and that we should not let the lack of data stop us from moving forward on the things that we know are important, and including the things that you've talked about today, Councilmember White. So I appreciate you raising that.
I appreciate it, and I have a lot of other questions that I clearly won't get to, but I do want to make this point because I think it's an important one. What I didn't hear from any of the agencies testifying is what more data we need, and to me it seems very clear that we need more data if we are going to address the disparate outcomes that we're seeing. I think we're making some very broad assumptions. I think we're kind of throwing money at-risk students when that means so many different things. I'm not clear on how that money is being spent, if we're tracking the outcomes for the way that money is being spent so we can get better at the way that we are spending it, funneling it to specific resources, to specific students in need. And I hope this is something that we can work together on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember White. Councilmember Che for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the agency representatives for coming and testifying today. I do want to follow up on the very important line of questions of Councilmember White, but before I get back into that, I want to say at a more general level, it appears as though we have these dueling narratives. We hear from the auditor and then we hear from the agency heads. So I want to ask, and I guess I'll direct it to you, Ms. Young, what is in the auditor's report that you would say, yes, we're not doing this, but we should be, and we are going to do it? In other words, is there nothing there? Because, your presentation suggested that, my goodness, we're like on the right path, we're following everything, it's all good. Is there nothing in that report that you can take and implement and do better with?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to answer that question. And thank you for your patience with what I know is a robust testimony. I do appreciate both the opportunity to clarify what I think is a positive narrative of growth from the district, of where we were and where we all want to go. And I do think it's important to emphasize that we have made enormous progress and there are places we still need to go and improve. And so I do think, again, that ideally, this is not an argument about, I think we're on the same page about many things. We want to grow and make our systems more efficient. We have a significant internal plan to continue to do that. In addition, there are data that we want to be able to collect over time. That is correct. We have grown from not collecting as much robust teacher data to collecting it now. And we are going to continue to collect and then report on that in the future. In addition, course data is a very large data collection that is important to focus on for the future. It is not something that can be done quickly. We have had internal planning committees to talk about a future state in which that could be accomplished. So we agree that there is more data to be collected, and we are on our way to get there.
Okay, so that's one aspect, more data to be collected. And then is there nothing in the auditor's report with respect to the matter of reporting data or sharing data that you're not now doing?
I mean, I think we always have room to think about new and responsive reporting. That's our goal, is to continuously think about what more would be meaningful in actually.
So there are some things in this report that we can take out and positively latch onto and possibly implement. Because as I said, it sounded like dueling narratives, da 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 da, and it didn't meet anywhere. But so there are things about reporting as well, right?
Well, we report a significant amount of information, and I think it is important to be clear on what we do already share, because I think I do want to focus. I mean, our intent was to clarify in those areas in which we already share. But like you said, there is always more to be shared. And for example, you know, a number of years ago, we did not collect and we were not in the position to share the teacher data that we will be sharing in the near future. And that's an exciting, and in which we did in our teacher report in retention of one time in 2019, which we are anticipating making more frequent and user-friendly in the future.
And then there's some other things, you know, you have stated, others have stated that we're the fastest improving district, you know, maybe in the country, I don't know. But that's against the baseline, right? I mean, so if you're like at the bottom of your league and then you move up some points, you might be the fastest growing, but you're hardly running with the fastest horses. So simply observing that we're the fastest improving, you know, I used to wonder, you know, when kids would get most improved trophies on teams I would coach, like, what does that mean exactly? But in any case, the fact of the matter is, here's something, and you can tell me if this is factually correct or not. The divide between low income and struggling students, and it usually lines up in connection with race, the divide between those students and students who are doing much better has in the past few years not only not shrunk, but it's increased. Is that correct?
First, I just want to go back to those gaps absolutely exist. So
no, are they widening or are they narrowing?
I think it depends on what measure you're talking about. In some cases, they are narrowing because students who are not at risk, for example, are growing faster, even though students who are more economically at risk are growing, just not as fast in some cases. But I do want to say that fastest improving means that more children are learning more, and that is important. And we should not make light of that. It is not the only thing, and it does not, you know, negate our responsibility to continue with urgency. But I think it is important to acknowledge the progress that our teachers and our children have made at the same time of taking the responsibility as an education sector to continue to move it faster.
And this I cheerfully do, but I think it has to be put in context. And I think that the divide, from all that I come to understand, you're saying, well, it depends on how you look at it. The divide is not narrowing, it's growing. So that's problematic. But going back to Councilmember White's line of questioning, which is of interest to me very much, about identifying students who are struggling, and then, because then there's the and then, providing supports for those students and providing this information early on. And one thing the auditor mentioned, which I have understood to be the case before, that these generalized tests, PARCC and that sort of thing, all very well, but the real indicators are the courses you're taking and the grades you're earning in them. and you're not prepared yet to have a full range of information about grades. Is that what you just said before?
Yes, I said that we do not collect grades at the state level. Grades are sometimes an indicator of how well a student is progressing in school, certainly. We do not collect grades at the state level.
So do you think or not that OSSE should be responsible for red flag warnings?
I think that this work is going on right now at the level of our schools. And I think that our schools have a robust amount of information that it may or may not be practical to collect and moderate at the state level in order to have the most responsive feedback that you're talking about. So schools collect a significant amount of information that our educators meet with their teams about regularly to identify, and that information is also constantly changing throughout the year, right? I mean, just as a parent, your son, not saying I know anything about this, forgets to turn in an assignment and their grade is a D. That may or may not be a warning. That may be that assignment goes in and that gets fixed the next day. Our schools and students have information at that level in order to both collect the information and interpret it.
But it's not necessarily an either or. It could be both. And it could be stronger if it were both from OSSE and the LEA, to identify students who may be struggling. I'm making a declaratory statement. You don't have to respond to that. I only have so much time, and I wanted to speak to Ms. Walker Davis just for a moment. I have heard many times that with respect to charter schools that they encourage students who may be struggling to leave the charter school and go to DCPS. Are you aware of any instances where charter schools do such a thing?
I am not, Councilmember Che, aware of that. If that's your question, no, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, have you heard anything, or maybe you don't know personally, but this is a fairly widespread understanding, and smoke, where there's smoke, there's fire. So this does not exist, is what you're saying. You're testifying.
I'm not testifying that it does not exist. You asked me if I have heard of such a thing. Now, anecdotally, do children leave schools after the beginning of the year? Absolutely, they do leave schools. But if your question is whether charters are encouraging them to do so, I have not heard that personally. Nothing has been reported to me. Am I aware that such a narrative exists? Yes, I am.
Have you ever thought to look into it?
I am a few months into my role. I can certainly consult with my team as to whether we've had any investigation about that particular matter. But what I can say to you is when we are made aware of those issues, the response of my staff would be to look into it, to do the appropriate follow-up with the school and the LEA, and to get to the bottom of that matter. But I can certainly consult with my team to find out if there were specific instances where we felt the need to have to do that.
Okay, well, thank you. And I am over my time, and like Councilmember White, I do have more, but we're done. And the chairman gives us a look. So I have to say thank you very much. And I turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman.
It's an evil chairman. Oh, am I unmuted? The next council member is Louis George.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Mendelson, and thanks to our witnesses for being here. It's good to see you all. Superintendent Young, I want to start with you with a few questions as follow-up. You testified that 18 LEAs use the Office of State Superintendent Statewide Student Information System, or SIS. Does this include DCPS?
No, it does not.
Okay. And my other question to that is, would mandating the usage of a single-wide statewide data system better facilitate tracking students over time, particularly those that move between LEAs?
No, we have that functionality now. Our students' enrollment records document in what schools they were, And that is captured at the statewide level, regardless of the technology used at any individual school.
Okay. The auditor cited Montana and what they provide to teachers as a good system. Can DC teachers access and use similar data for their students using longitudinal data?
So DC teachers can see the data of their currently enrolled students, and they can see some data from the historical record of a student, but not all of it that is similar to that report.
Okay. So for example, can I see what my 9th graders got in 8th grade?
So OSSE actually has a program and an application called Bridge to High School for participating LEAs. I think 91% of the eligible LEAs participate in it, which is a project that coordinates between middle schools with 8th graders moving into the 9th grade classroom. And those students and those schools do share data back and forth related to incoming high school students, related to prior enrollment, demographics, attendance, assessment, and status, as well as other coordinated actual communication efforts. So for those participating schools, that data is actually shared in advance to help smooth that transition from 8th to 9th grade.
Okay. And so why is the bridge to high school optional? Why not 100% participation?
Yeah, that's a great question. In part, it's optional because this work happens before those students transfer. So it is a collaborative, and it is a program that we also support significant supports with those staff and facilitation to support that work. But the students, once the student is in the school, the school can see a significant amount of that student's data once they're there.
Okay. And is DCPS part of that?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So, and then just to follow up to my first question, why is DCPS not using the statewide SIS system? What have they said is wrong with it?
Well, they've had their own system for some time. And so I don't know that it's a matter of what's wrong with it or not. They procure and implement their system that has been in place a number of years, but I can't particularly comment on the specifics of why they selected one over another.
Okay. That'll be a follow-up question for the deputy mayor. The other question I had around was in the performance oversight hearing last week, I asked about the current number of 9th graders on track to graduate and how that compares year over year. And you said to answer that question, you need to look at PARCC scores, but also credit accumulation, attendance, and discipline. So I'm concerned, similar to what Councilmember Che said earlier, which is true, is that we have kids who are falling behind right now, but we don't know where they are, what they need, or how they're getting into this situation. Why isn't OSSE collecting course level data, and how can you help determine who's off track, particularly when we don't have PARCC scores to inform who needs support?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for asking it. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, our goal has always been to grow the robustness of our data systems, and we have done that, prioritizing some of the things we've talked about today, including enrollment and attendance and discipline, which are inputs to the kind of question that you have. Course data, we do not yet collect. It is something that is on the future horizon. It is an enormous amount of work to think and ingest that data when you're talking about course data from multiple schools and LEAs, but it is something that we would like to achieve at some point. And so, as I mentioned before, though, the schools that are and LEAs that are doing this work with our students do have the capacity and are doing this work now. And I just don't want us to think that, this cannot be focused on or done before there's a system to share at the state level. Because for example, our schools right now, many of them have processes by which they review data of their, for example, 9th graders and look at it with the educators and say, okay, based on this is what we know, the grades, the course, who's a high flyer with these teachers, their behavior, how do we need to work with them and their families to get them different types of interventions, either academically or socio-emotionally.
I mean, I hear you, but kids move between LEAs all the time, and so we need a statewide system in particular for those kids who are changing LEAs. Do we know how many ninth graders dropped out after last school year?
I'm not sure I have that information in front of me, but I can certainly find what data we have there specifically.
Okay. One of the things that came up is public charter school teachers aren't required to be certified. Does OSSE track how many teachers in charter schools are certified? Why or why not?
Yes, we do collect that information as part of our teacher data collection, but you are correct that they are not required to be licensed. But we do collect but some are, I will say. OSSE provides licenses to educators who are enrolled in charter schools, and we do collect that information. And we are excited to have a more robust reporting system moving forward. We also include and will be including moving forward other types of teacher data information.
Okay, is that posted on the report card?
Right now, the data for licensure, I believe, is only posted for DC schools, but I can confirm with my team.
Okay. Earlier, you said OSSE now has a statewide, teacher ID system. Are these linked to student unique identifiers? Why or why not?
We currently do not have the teacher-student course linkages. So
okay.
We have teacher IDs and we have student IDs. We would need that large a body of course data in order to do that. So that provides you the opportunity to do a lot of things. A lot of things that are used for teacher-student course data linkages are things like teacher evaluation systems or other types of teacher historical data. And we do not currently have that course linkage right now, but we are building the foundation for that in the future.
I hear. So how does the School Reform Act govern what OSSE can and cannot collect? Can OSSE compel charter schools to submit data specifically around teachers? And is there any teacher data that OSSE collects and reports to the federal government but doesn't show on school report cards?
OSSE has the authority to mandate data collection, and we do so. The increasing amount of data that we've collected over time is a reflection of our increasing requirements of data collection, as well as the requirements around what and how those things are submitted and compliance over them. I believe that we collect and share the same data information that is reported to the federal government for the teacher collection, but I don't know specifically the overlap of fields, so I can certainly look into that further.
Okay. On the issue of exit codes, the report says there are essentially no values for end of year exits for all students or mid-year exits for students leaving the public school system. Why doesn't OSSE collect monthly exit data? DC code 38-205 says OSSE is to collect data enrollment and withdrawals by the 5th of every month.
Yeah, that's, thank you for asking that question. OSSE does collect ongoing exit codes data. Exits are a part of the student's enrollment file. And it has to do, and there are a large number of them. We collect them daily, and we require that within 5 days of an exit that the LEA report that back to us. And so that is required. But that is literally documenting an exit from a student. And so we actually exceed that requirement by requiring that to be collected daily.
Okay, I am over my time. I'll just end and say that I'm concerned that we can have, I guess, such a profound disagreement on what seems like a simple question. Does DC have a longitudinal data system? I think, the auditor has said we don't have one. OSSE says we do. I'm frustrated that we can't pay for a 2-year analysis, that we could pay for a 2-year analysis and still come out without a clear answer. The auditor has put forward this mass report that's been critical of what we have today. not just where we were, but where we are today. We need more data. And so I agree fully with Councilmember White. We need more data, in particular around courses and teachers. So I hope we continue to work together as a committee and with the upcoming RPP advisory panel to further study these important issues. Our students need, and all of us. I have more questions, but Councilmember Henderson, it's on you.
Thank you, Councilmember Lewis George. Councilmember Henderson for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to say good afternoon, but good evening. I see you guys for another Friday night. I want to first acknowledge, I was going through the report and talking with my team just in terms of like how far OSSE has come. I pulled up a year. I was like, wait, 2013, who was DME? And who was the head of OSSE? And who was at public? Like literally all of you are, I'm not saying new to the process, but you weren't here at the beginning, right? And so I would think there was even a year in particular where OSSE had maybe 3 or 4 superintendents in a year. So I just want to acknowledge that there has been progress in terms of the stability of the system, but I want to ask some questions now. Okay, so as I talked with the auditor, there was a period of time where I would say there was probably some tension between our LEAs in terms of how they report data to OSSE. Are there any remaining subject matters where charter LEAs report to PCSB and then the PCSB reports that information to OSSE? Dr. Walker Davis or Shana, y'all, either one of you can answer.
Just for this one remaining last year, discipline falls into that category and will be therefore subsequently automated directly from the LEA as a feed to OSSE.
Okay, and will that be a quarterly feed, a daily feed, what kind of feed?
It is likely to be monthly.
Okay, because I know that one of the issues, or at least that used to be in the past, and again, I'm dusting off some of my cobwebs, is around the fact that for some of our LEAs, they would be hesitant to mark something as a suspension, and therefore it would look as though a student were absent for 20 days, even though they were suspended, and vice versa, and all of those things. So I think that the automated feed piece is important. So suspension is the only thing that is still a pass-through.
That's my understanding. And I think just quickly, you point out something important about the use and interpretation of data, because like you said, some of this data is actually fluid. So discipline data actually does change when you get, different types of suspensions and how they're documented. And so it is important, as you said, to be thoughtful in how we collect and report it based on the timing and how we're using it.
Okay, I want to follow up on something that I think came up at your performance oversight hearing around mobility data, because I know that has come up as a conversation. And I just want to acknowledge again, it looks like to me from the data that you provided to the committee, we stopped collecting mobility data in March of last year. Is that accurate?
Yes, at the time when schools closed due to the public health emergency.
Okay, so in terms of exit codes for the end of last school year, how were we able to even gather some of that data in terms of the number of students who exited or entered the system?
Yes, so we collect, as I mentioned, we require exits and entrances from the system to be documented when schools find out within 5 days. But we then started collecting all entry exit data again, as we always have from the beginning of this year moving forward.
Okay, so we have not had any gaps for school year 2021?
No.
Okay.
That's correct.
Now, one of the things I have to sort of say, and this has been my gripe, not with just you, but with a lot of our agencies, the website is a mess in terms of the ability for people to find information in a readily available format. And that was one of the things that the auditor report did bring up in terms of the ability to do data visualizations. I know that you provide information in Excel format and those kinds of things, but for me to have to download every year and create my own spreadsheet and then do my own analysis is a lot. Where I know in comparison, some other states do have the capability on their websites for you to run reports within the system. Is this something that OSSE is looking towards doing in the future?
Yeah, I think we absolutely want to continue to increase the value that our websites and public data can have for the public, as well as running part of our part of our plan for future infrastructure is to invest in that type of reporting and public-facing functionality.
Let's talk about infrastructure. How much money has OSSE spent in the last, I don't know, 5 to 6 years on infrastructure in terms of your data systems?
Sure. Well, I would say in the FY17, well, I will say there's a couple of different ways that we spend money on data. One, we have an enormously robust data staffing team, as well as a strong CIO team that helps do the infrastructure that we talk about. But in addition,
right, no, I'm talking about from a capital side, and I'm trying to make a point here because, you know, there was a time I recall as a staffer, OSSE would get money, local dollars and capital monies to do data systems, and then it would get swiped for other capital projects. And so I just wanted to understand how much money have you had to actually spend to build out your systems?
Yeah, that's right. And thank you. I mean, in the approved budget in FY17, we received a 13.9 million enhancement, which was, there were sweeps in interim years. And so it ended up being 9.4 million. And so we spent about 4.5 million over the first couple of years on some of the foundational infrastructure and reporting functionality that we talked about earlier. And then we're investing in the early childhood system and an upgrade of our early childhood data systems. And then the remaining about 2.5 million will be used for the capital data modification infrastructure that we've been talking about just towards the end of my testimony.
Okay, so you have about 2.5 million left. Do you feel like you need more?
Yes. I mean, as I mentioned,
I know that's a hard question. While
I will say that, like,
Deputy
yes,
Mayor sitting right there, but
yeah, this is ongoing work, and so there is always more. There is always more funding that is needed, and that we have received to support this work to continue it forward.
I'm trying to get through some more questions. There's obviously a lot of information that's available in your performance oversight report. You did provide the list of data requests that have come in. What's the most common data set requested that OSSE is not able to provide?
Common data set that we are not able to provide, potentially, I mean, teacher information is one. We get a lot of requests for, student level data that is personally identifiable that has to go through a different type of data privacy process. Mm-hmm. But I would say that teacher data is certainly a big one, and that's one that we are hoping to accommodate.
For this, you guys moving to collecting this teacher data, does it require a different set of agreement outside of just what you get with the LEAs? Like, are you going to have to talk specifically to particular employee union groups in order for OSSE to receive that information?
No.
Okay, so this is really just a negotiation. I wouldn't call it a negotiation, an agreement between OSSE and each of the LEAs in terms of collecting this information.
Well, it's not so much an agreement, it's just a process. So we set up, as we mentioned, this is one where we've had to build the infrastructure to collect it. And now that we have that, we provide guidance to LEAs about what they are required to submit.
Okay. Are you concerned that in collecting some of this information, and maybe teacher is not the right piece, but around collecting course data, which a number of my colleagues have brought up, is that there really is no way to sort of compare across LEA in terms of just a course name, right? So yes, for some, Algebra 1, it should look the same across LEA, but United States history could look different. Some English courseworks can look different. If and when OSSE starts collecting this information, how would you differentiate the fact that each LEA has a different definition for how they define it? Frankly, each LEA has a different definition on how they define a grade. An A in DCPS looks very different than an A in BASIS, for instance. How would you talk about that?
Well, I think what you're pointing out in terms of the course definition is exactly why it takes a long time to plan for it, because you are taking essentially like a collection of information that is not common and having to create definitions and matrices to try and make it in a way common in order for it to be helpful, which is why collecting it at a single centralized state level makes it extremely difficult. And it takes a long time to plan because otherwise you're just getting a bunch of information that doesn't match and you don't know how to make meaning of it. And it really is important if we're collecting it that it be worthwhile for all the people that are going to have to actually enter it and send it and clean it and report it for it to really be worthwhile. So you've examined the exact reason why it takes quite some time to get ready to do that.
So on the teacher side, though, that's a fairly simple process, right? How many teachers do you have? How long have they been in the system? What's their level of licensure? All of that kind of stuff. What's the timeline in terms of OSSE being able to collect its first full data set on that information?
I would say that our infrastructure, we're collecting it this year, and probably we report on it in the next calendar year or so. It's being collected in this year.
Okay. Really quickly, a question in terms of exit code information. When a student transfers from a DCPS or public charter school to out of state or a non-public school, is that a code option within the OSSE system as of right now?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, if you could just allow me just one additional question.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. I know that it was sort of raised earlier around the collection of information in terms of at risk, and perhaps this is a question more for the deputy mayor. You know, there's been a number of conversations in terms of how the at-risk dollars are spent, how the at-risk students are tracked, et cetera. We did that definition a number of years ago. Do you feel like the at-risk definition using SNAP and TANF serves us well today? Or should we take a look at how we redefine that? Because I heard Councilmember White talking about income pieces, and I recognize that we would have to then require parents to voluntarily report that information, which would mean that the data would be incomplete. One of the reasons we chose SNAP and TANF was that was something that was automatic, that didn't require asking for that information. But is that still a good measurement, or should we be a bit more robust in our definition of at-risk students going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Councilmember, for the question. I think it's a very good one and one we think a lot about. You'll have noticed in our UPSFF working group report, we actually did break out the categories to do our analysis. So we looked at TANF and SNAP and overage and those under the care of foster care system and so forth. So I do think it's important that we keep an eye on the specifics of the definition. I do think it serves us well in the sense that I think it is a good proxy for what we're trying to get at with it, which is to say, how do we identify the needs of students? I think the question of whether or not we need to revisit as a definition is an enormous one, because as you know, the process of getting collective agreement, even based on the education research about what the right measures are, is enormously difficult and time consuming and potentially disruptive. And so I do think for the time being, we have a good enough definition of at risk, which does serve us well. And I think we've got to continue to do the work you have just described, which is how do we ensure that the money that LEAs get for use with at-risk students is well spent.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember. That's going to conclude the questioning for the executive. The record in this matter, I'd indicated this beginning, is open for 2 weeks. And I say that in case there's anybody who is watching who wishes to submit comments for the record, they may do so. I want to thank everybody. It's 7 o'clock, actually it's 7:10 on a Friday evening. This was supposed to happen yesterday. We could have kept you at the end of our hearing, just started at the end of the hearing yesterday, but that hearing ended at 10:15 p.m. So then, in any event, I want to thank everybody. And this will be a continuing discussion and a matter of attention for the committee. The time is 7:10 in the evening, and this hearing is adjourned.